Alaikum and welcome to our live Srebrenica Remembered special. It has been 22 years since the atrocity that has been described as the worst crime on European soil since World War II took place in Srebrenica on this very day. A genocide that claimed the lives of more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys.
This was a massacre that in part resulted from the failure of those in power who turned a blind eye to those who were defenseless and vulnerable. The former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan has said the tragedy of Srebrenica will forever haunt the history of the United Nations.
22 years on from this tragedy, the wounds are still fresh, as many are yet to find and bury their loved ones. Every year, the International Commission of Missing Persons unearth bones from mass graves, sometimes only finding and identifying small bone fragments, leaving the families with the difficult decision of burying an incomplete body or waiting and hoping that the remaining bones may surface in a newly discovered mass grave.
Please join us in remembering Srebrenica, a genocide that took place for most of us in our lifetime. We are live until 2 p.m. and we want to hear from you. Please share your messages of support on how the genocide has affected you. We want to hear from you to lend a voice to our brothers and sisters who have suffered so tragically and continue to do so. The number to call is our usual studio number on 0207 274 6423.
And please do also tweet us your thoughts and your prayers. Hashtag Srebrenica Remembered at Islam Channel TV.
We will be joining the live memorial service in Srebrenica at about 10:30 a.m., where every year families come to remember the dead and many who still have not been found. But before we move on with the show, what role did the Dutch UN soldiers play in the genocide of 8,000 Bosniak men and boys, and what conclusion did the Dutch Appeals Court come to? But before we have a look at this clip, please keep in mind, if you have children at home, that you may find some scenes in this clip distressing.
A Dutch appeals court ruled the state was partly to blame for the deaths of some 350 Muslim men in the 1995 Srebrenica genocide, ordering it to pay partial compensation. Judge Gebke Dulek said in an hour-long ruling that the court found that the Dutch state acted unlawfully, largely upholding a 2014 ruling by a lower court. She also added that the Dutch soldiers had facilitated the separation of men and boys amongst the refugees. Almost 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed in the 1995 genocide, Europe's worst atrocity since World War II. It occurred on the 13th of July 1995, when lightly armed Dutch UN peacekeepers were overrun by Bosnian Serb forces as they sought to protect tens of thousands of refugees who had flooded to their base in what was meant to be a UN safe haven. Both the Dutch state and the relatives of victims had appealed the 2014 Dutch lower court ruling that the state was liable for the deaths of some 350 men who were sent off the base along with other refugees. This ruling also found that the Dutch state is liable for some 30% of any damages awarded, as it was uncertain whether the men would have survived had they stayed inside the compound. The Srebrenica killings have been denounced as an act of genocide by the UN court set up in The Hague to try those behind the atrocities of the Balkans Wars. And in the Netherlands, the events still stir controversy, with questions remaining over the Dutch Blue Helmets' role. A lawyer for 206 former Dutch peacekeepers said they were suing the government for damages for sending them to defend Srebrenica, after the defense minister last year admitted it had been a mission impossible. Total damages would amount to around 4.5 million euros. The Dutch troops entrenched in their base had taken in thousands of refugees from the enclave. But overwhelmed, they first shut the gates to new arrivals and then allowed the Bosnian Serbs to evacuate the refugees. The men and boys were separated and taken in buses to their deaths. Defense Minister Janine Hennis-Plasschaert last year admitted the battalion had been sent to Bosnia without adequate preparation, without the proper means, with little information to protect a peace that no longer existed. She then said it was an unrealistic mission in impossible circumstances.
I think that just highlights one of the many ways in which the Bosnian people were let down throughout the war.
I think it's one of those things, unless you've heard about it, I think clips like this would actually give you a sort of a snippet of the information of what it is that happened to help you understand that situation.
Yeah, it's such a complex, so many complexities going into the end result that it's difficult to kind of pinpoint one.
Yeah,
but obviously, hopefully throughout the show today, we're going to touch upon some of those, inshallah. So we will have various guests joining us throughout the show today until 2 p.m. And our first guests are Rahad Sadiq, who went to Srebrenica with the delegation in 2014, and Musti Kamal, a political commentator who also visited in 2014.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show. We're glad that you could both join us to tell us about your experience, because actually you both went on the same delegation together. What is it actually that made you choose to actually go on this visit, and how did it impact you? I'll start with you, Musti.
Sure, absolutely. So as you said, the genocide that happened in Bosnia was one of the worst things to happen in Europe since World War II. And the gravity of it I had heard of. But because there is an absence of Bosnia from our curriculums, it wasn't something that I'd really got to grapple with. It wasn't something that I'd really got to learn about in depth. So when the opportunity arose with this Remembering Srebrenica Foundation to take people on delegations there, I jumped at it because I did want to learn more about it and see how it's affected people's lives and continues to affect people's lives till today.
Absolutely. I think for everyone, it's varying reasons of why they would go on such a trip. I mean, you're both quite young. Rahad, yourself as well, you went on this delegation. What actually made you decide to actually do this?
I hadn't actually known much about the genocide at the time when I was given the opportunity to go. And I only remember that my dad, when I was probably about 7 years old, had told me about Zlata's diary. So it's kind of similar to the idea of like Anne Frank's diary.
Yeah.
She was in Bosnia at the time and she was writing about her experience. And I'd kind of just found like, oh, I don't know what my dad's telling me to read. Doesn't like, like Harry Potter or anything. And then I just remembered when I was approached about going on the delegation that it was something that we, even amongst like our families and like literature and just even in our curriculums, we don't really like access, or we don't think about. And I wanted to learn more. Even on the delegation, I felt like I hadn't fully equipped myself with understanding or thinking about the nuances of what had happened, to give myself the time to internalize and reflect on, okay, so what is it that went wrong, and then also what do we do after?
I think this is one of the things that is such a shame, because I know for me, I took part in the appeal here for the first time 3 years ago, and that was really the first time I learned and understood about what took place, even though I was around 15, 16 when it was happening. So I continue to be quite shocked that we don't hear more about it, we don't learn about it in schools. It's very close to us, it's, as we said, European soil, but we're just not, certainly not throughout my education, getting that information. But it really does have an impact on you. I went on a delegation as well myself, and I was hugely moved by the people I saw, the things I heard, the experiences that I had there. Musti, how do you feel the trip has impacted you?
In a huge way. So of course, reading about it is one thing, but actually going there and speaking to people who both suffered during the genocide, but also who are now seeking to rebuild lives in various ways. So you mentioned the work of the IMCP and the sort of work they're doing to salvage people's bones. And that's quite a heavy task for people to do. And the way that it affects families was something that was a huge learning curve for me. And it was an amazing opportunity to be able to speak to a lot of the families. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's groundbreaking, the work they do. And obviously the procedures that they've perfected throughout this is now going on to help in other countries in Syria and around the world. So it is hugely groundbreaking stuff.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that, that all of you have kind of mentioned, which also rings true for me, is the fact that although you'd heard about it, you never really knew about it, and there was never an emphasis on what happened in Bosnia, and in particular the genocide in Srebrenica. And I probably was about your age, Liz, when I first heard about it, and I thought, oh, okay, this is pretty interesting. And then I remember reading very lightly around it, but never really understanding the magnitude of what actually took place at that time. But inshallah, before we continue on with the discussion, we'd like to urge the viewers who are watching to please call in if you have something to say, messages of support for those brothers and sisters in Bosnia. Please do call in. We would love to hear from you. The number is on your screen throughout the show, inshallah. Now, we talk about the impact as well. So, Rahad, obviously, as a young woman, who went there, and a lot of the people that you would have spoken to were probably women, mothers who, had lost, their sons and their husbands. What impact did that have on you?
That's interesting because the year I went, we didn't have the theme yet of gender and genocide, which is this year's theme. And I remember one of the mothers of Srebrenica, so those are the ladies that sort of survived the genocide, and they mentioned that one of them said that she'd lost 40 male members of her family. So that's, I couldn't fathom just losing 40 male members of your family, and I was trying to kind of think, oh, how would that be if that had happened to me? And then I think also I was reading a book on it by Michael Sells, I think, and he was just talking about the complexity of what was happening to the women in the genocide, because the genocide was mainly like towards the men, so it was mainly the men and the boys that were affected by it, and then the women were kind of left over, and the soldiers would sort of abuse them in different ways. And I just thought it's kind of psychologically very damaging, but also it was there was sort of a idea of the sacred, and they were kind of desecrating the sacred, and similar of how they would destroy the mosques, they would try to do that even to the women. And I just thought it was a really horrific way of just treating women in war, and I think it has also set a precedent for just warfare in general, and it was just awful. It was just, especially if they've lived with it for 22 years, I thought it would, you didn't want to sort of tokenize them and take pictures of them and just make them feel like, oh look, I'm with a woman that survived the genocide, but you also just wanted to give that support of, we're here for you. Yeah,
I think it's about the support, and it's also about the, you know, the idea of learning from this. You know, it can't be forgotten. You know, we said this must never happen again, and yet we see these things happening again and again. Like we're not learning. So it is about, I think this is one of the key things that I took away from it, that we cannot forget what happened, and we have to keep talking about this and sharing the facts with other people, sharing the experiences with other people, and also trying to get an understanding of how things escalated. Because if we look at, well, if you look at Yugoslavia, like pre-war Yugoslavia, you know, they never thought it would happen to them. So I think this is something we have to be very mindful of. People like us who are very comfortable, we think maybe it will never happen to us, but they're exactly the same. They thought it would never happen to them. So this, I think this is one of the important things about why we should keep remembering these incidences. Was there anything that you kind of took away that made you feel compelled to continue to propagate these messages and these reminders?
Absolutely. So just like you said, the gravity of the word genocide is huge and enormous. And we keep on repeating the point, but this was just 1995. Just 22 years ago. That's my entire lifespan. So it's in such recent memory, and it was something that we'd promised ourselves not to repeat again. And the fact that it occurred in a continent where the previous catastrophe had happened just 70 years earlier is horrific. But one of the things that really compelled me to sort of spread the message about Bosnia more is the strength that you mentioned of the mothers and the women. Because, of course, 2/3 of the population of Bosniak men in certain areas was wiped out. And because of the way the society was set up, that meant livelihoods were destroyed, income was destroyed. And so the way that the women and the Mothers Association, actually in particular, has been able to rebuild lives for their families, I think is really inspirational. And it's just one of the examples of the ways that Bosnians have shown resilience since then.
Absolutely.
And I think also what I found really heartening, but also I felt sort of maybe underwhelmed from my own capacity, but when we'd asked them, we had this deal of, oh, we want to do something for you. And all the survivors or the mothers would say, just tell people about us. That's really all we'd want. And you kind of feel ashamed in your own way of, we're not even doing that, that they would just appreciate us having these discussions, telling people so that they're not forgotten. So they don't want money, they don't want to, you know, to be relocated or anything like that. They just want the international community, they want us in our homes where we're safe to tell others and remind them of they're still going through this injustice. So there are some mothers that, or just Bosnians that haven't had justice about the fact that their families have been affected by the genocide. I think even when we went to the Commission for Missing People, that they would say we have to be so precise in the way that we do the investigation, because even if there's 0.5% chance that this isn't the person that we're identifying, that will give room for someone to say actually it wasn't a genocide and that we're making up these statistics. And I just thought that was horrific. They have such a massive responsibility to ensure that every individual is identified, so that for us who are skeptical and we don't want to acknowledge our participation in it, to kind of convince us, I guess.
Yeah. I think it's important to actually recognise the fact. I think you mentioned something that was very important there, is that it could have been used as a means to say actually this wasn't a genocide, and it took up until last year for it actually to be recognised as a genocide. Why do you think that's particularly important? Because it took 21 years for this to actually happen. Musti.
Absolutely. So I think it's crucial, actually. That's one of the main things, that we do recognize this as a genocide, because there are lots of people and organizations and countries around the world which are yet to do so, including their neighbors. So Serbia is a country which has yet to acknowledge it. And I think for closure for the families, and for families to come to terms with what has happened, of course, no one can replace the loss of family members. But in terms of intellectually coming to terms with the fact that people around us are no longer isolating us, which has been a staple of both during the conflict, but also since then. It's really important that the Bosnians don't feel isolated.
Yeah.
And by recognizing it as a genocide leads to other things. For example, inclusion in curriculums and spreading the message about what we really should be spreading the message about.
I think it does show that there was, for a time, this political negligence about what happened. I mean, you were mentioning earlier, Liz, that, you know, we have like these phrases like never forget. And yet, you know, it wasn't a question about forgetting when it came to Bosnia and the genocide that happened there, but it was a case of either being in denial or not wanting to admit the mistakes that had been made, because there were numerous mistakes that had been made during this time, wasn't there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is one of the things that we see when we're looking at post-war years. You know, how is it dealt with? How can people recover from that? And if it's denied, how can you expect people to recover from something? So it really, you know, kind of stunts that process and interferes with it.
Absolutely, which is why exactly that we're having such a show, is because to show A, our solidarity, and B, to kind of spread that awareness, because like you said, it's not something that we hear about often. It's not in our school curriculums. It's not something that we hear often about in the media as much as we hear about other conflicts that have happened around the world. So I think it's very, very important that we continue having this conversation and this discussion, because obviously it hasn't happened enough.
Yeah.
So, but inshallah, we are going to be coming back to the rest of this, inshallah.
Yeah,
so thank you so much for joining us, inshallah. We are going to go to a break, but do stay with us, because we'll be going live to the ceremony in a few moments, inshallah. So we'll see you after this. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to our live Srebrenica Remembered special. Today we're marking the 22nd anniversary of the Srebrenica Genocide, and we want to hear from you to lend a voice to our brothers and sisters who have suffered so tragically and continue to do so. The number to call is our usual studio number, 0207 274 6423.
Also, tweet us with your thoughts and prayers using the hashtag Srebrenica Remembered, and the handle is @IslamChannelTV. But before we continue with our discussion, we'll be doing a live link right now to the memorial service that is taking place in Srebrenica as we speak. Oh, we will be in a bit, as I'm told. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to connect.
But inshallah, we will connect to that soon. The annual Peace March, or the Mars Mirror as it's more commonly known, is a commemorative walk in honour of the 15,000 men who formed the column and embarked upon a perilous 63-mile walk from Srebrenica to Tuzla in an attempt to escape Serb persecution. Over 70,000 citizens of Sarajevo start the march from Sarajevo to Tuzla today. It's really, we watch it every year, subhanAllah, on these shows, and it's really a moving experience to see this. And obviously, when we do so, we remember the experiences of the people who were actually on the march during those days. I'm sure you guys all met Hassan Hasanovic at the museum at the cemetery in Potocari. He's obviously a survivor of the Death March, one of the very, very few people that actually did survive. And, you know, his experiences and the experiences of people like him, it's deeply, deeply distressing. But at the same time, as we were saying, very important that we, you know, retell these stories.
Absolutely. I think for me, I find it sort of hard to imagine having to walk 63 miles when you're actually, you know, in a state of fear and panic. You know, you've got families, young children, those who are elderly, those who might be, you know, having mobility issues, to have to walk this sort of distance to actually get to a place of safety. So it's kind of like, it's one of those things that unless you find a way to experience it in some way, it's quite hard to understand. We also now have Sister Seema Awan joining us, and you were also part of a 2014 delegation, albeit not the same one as our two guests here. But actually, what made you actually go on this delegation?
Well, while growing up, my mum always mentioned watching the Bosnian genocide on the news, and she was always affected by it. So one time at work, I was told about this opportunity, and I wanted to find out more about it. Outside of work, I also do a lot of humanitarian and human rights stuff. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to find out more and see what I could do.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned you do a lot of humanitarian work, and it's really important that whilst we concentrate on things that are happening today, that we do cast an eye back to things that have happened in the past, because we've got so much that we can learn from that, so much that we can reflect upon, and we can see similarities. Was that your experience? Did you have that experience while you were there, that you could almost see how events that happened there are reflected in modern day society as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because while I was there, one of the questions I asked one of the tour guides was that I see some of the things that are happening here are actually happening in the UK, and what advice can you give me in order to make sure that doesn't happen? Yeah. And I think at the time some people thought that maybe I was being a little bit extreme in the way that I was thinking, but I think with the recent events happening in the UK with Brexit and hate crimes on the rise, I think it was very relevant.
Yeah, I mean, we are certainly seeing a peak in you know, these kind of incidences, hate crimes and everything, since you know, Brexit and, you know, other kind of world events, and so it's not a huge jump really, is it? And we have to be very mindful of what's come before and what potentially lies ahead.
I think it's absolutely true. I think we need to kind of understand that language and propaganda that is used plays very much into how people react and formulate their opinions, that actually then translate into actions that are taken. I mean, you know, looking at the history of Bosnia and, you know, just the lead up to the war, you see when you look back at a lot of propaganda that was used at the time, you can see how people's opinions had drastically changed, where neighbours turned on neighbours that they'd known for years, have lived side by side and had no issues with. And, you know, it's quite an interesting way that this is now being mirrored here in the UK in the language that's being used against Muslims in certain communities. How much do you feel that actually the propaganda did lead to it when it came to the war that happened in 1992?
Absolutely. So I think it's really interesting the role that language actually plays in genocide, in particular the Bosnian genocide. So you saw the Serb generals, Mladic, Karadzic, using language that harken back to the Ottoman times. And they sort of tried to phrase this as a war of civilizations. And I think that's really dangerous, because not only was this a Muslim genocide, but it was a genocide that happened in Europe. And that's something that we often forget, because this happened within the borders of Europe when we promised the continent that it wouldn't happen again after World War II. And so the fact that we've been able to alienate the fact that this is a European genocide, I think is really interesting, but also plays into the narrative of the people who committed these atrocities in the first place, who tried to phrase this as a war of civilization. Whereas Muslims had been, as you said, part of that landscape, part of those countries for thousands of years. And it just simply wasn't the case that there wasn't peace at that time or previously. And so this turn was really interesting, and the way that people's emotions are sort of brought up in this nationalistic pride, I think is very dangerous and very relevant today.
Absolutely. I think we have to kind of remember, you know, that it's not just words. I think a lot of the times we take things like what's said in the media very lightly. We think, oh, well, you know, I don't agree with what they said, but whatever, I just won't read their paper, I won't listen to this news outlet. So, and you think that that's enough, but a lot of the times it isn't enough, because there are people out there who probably don't have the experiences that you do, who maybe are surrounded by people from different cultures and nationalities in order to actually formulate opinions that are more well-rounded. So it's quite dangerous the way language can be used. But absolutely. I'd like to urge the viewers to remember to call in, you know, with any messages of support for those who have survived what's happened in Bosnia, as well as those who are watching today who actually feel very affected by what has happened. Seema, you know, mashallah, you did have this opportunity to go. Being there and, you know, visiting some of the places and hearing some of the stories, how has this trip actually impacted you since coming back?
It's impacted me a lot, because I think I saw a lot of similarities. One of them was the media. So, you know, you have people in the media talking about things like, you know, referring to people as swarms and cockroaches. And let's be quite real. When you're referring to people like that, that's a mandate for murder. And so being able to go to Srebrenica and seeing the stages of genocide take place, I was able then to come back and deliver it to young people, especially in Muslim communities like Tower Hamlets, and them being able to differentiate. And I think it's important to be able to counteract what's happening in the media. So there's a guy called Miqdad Varsi who does a lot of work in holding the media accountable for the things that they say. I think that kind of thing is really, really important. Yeah. So yeah, I think if people can get involved and bring the media to account and go into communities and reach out, I think people should do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because we see this, you know, as we saw in the former Yugoslavia, as the countries were declaring their own independence, you get that vibe of nationalism, naturally, I think, rising up. But and I think we can, as we've all said, we've seen that with Brexit and with people wanting that independence from our structure. We can kind of see that again, and it can be potentially worrying times. Seema, what's your thoughts on how we can today reflect upon what's happening and feed into the narrative that fights against that?
So personally, some of the things that I've done is that I've on my Facebook, I'm quite political, and I make sure that the people on my Facebook that generally wouldn't speak to me face to face would come and ask me certain questions about what I've posted. I go into the communities, I go to youth centres and speak to young people. I think young people are the future, and it's very important that whereas the older generation is harder to change their mind, it's easier with younger people to change it and for them to be the force of change. So things like that, campaigning is very important. And more importantly, making people understand what genocide is and the lead up to genocide.
Absolutely. I think it's very important to kind of start things at grassroots levels, because, you know, it's very, you know, all well and good to say, like, I'm going to have this campaign, but campaigns will only have as much effect as the people that you can reach who are on the ground. So it's about having that grassroots level interaction. We also have a caller on the line. We have a Dr. Fatima on the line. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Fatima.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome to the show, sister. I believe you have a message for us.
Yes, I do, and this might take a tiny bit of time, so I hope you allow me that. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate the young people there. I can't tell you how impressed I am to see people who weren't even there at the time of the genocide, or maybe hardly there, and, you know, just begin, and mashallah, they are so concerned about it. This is amazing to see. What I'd like to say is, like, I was 13 when this happened, and I was in Saudi Arabia, and I distinctly remember the sort of the feelings that had come into the air and the way the people were affected. It was quite profound. And what I think I'd like to bring to the studio today and to the viewers who are watching is this. There is a difference between what the Muslims feel today with respect to Syria and Palestine and all that is happening. And back then, because we didn't have something trending, hashtagging every second, people's conscience were taken over, and it really affected them deeply, so much so that feeling of misery in a neighboring Muslim state remained with them for a very long time. But today, even though, mashallah, we do have a lot of campaigning for Syria, and people, if you see, largely the masses seem to be unaffected by it. And I do not know, I mean, if you look at the Holocaust and all the attempts to keep it alive, which should rightly be so, because there were humans as well who were killed, I do not understand. I mean, it's only a few brilliant people like sitting out there in your studios and mashallah Islam channel itself who would like to keep this alive. But if you see, largely the masses seem to be unconcerned. And I think I do not know what does it boil down to. Maybe it's because our iman is weak, or maybe, as the Prophet ﷺ said, we love the world too much. But we should be, I think, concerned deeply with keeping this alive, and that doesn't seem to be the case. I mean, as of like your program today, I do have a lot of people who are politically aware, but hardly anyone knew about this, and that's quite sad.
Yeah,
that is quite sad, and I do not know how you can make it. I wouldn't say popular, but I would say remember it more. I don't know how should we work at it, but we should be keeping this alive. Absolutely. And I would like the panel there to talk about this, about how do we get this back into our conscience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Fantastic points. I was nodding away there. I completely agree with everything that she said. And I think in terms of keeping this alive and propagating the message, obviously, as we all know, whenever we go out with a delegation, we have to make a pledge, which is our promise to keep it alive, basically. And this is a lot of work. This is the work that the charity does. So I want to hear a little bit about your pledges now and what you promised to do and how's it gone. So I'm going to start with you, Seema. What did you pledge to do to get your place on the trip, and how's that gone for you?
What I had pledged was, I think mainly because I work with a youth charity, was to go into schools and go into youth centres and deliver workshops to young people. And what age are you talking to? I was talking to anything between 14 to 25. Okay, and how did they... Were many of them aware of what happened even? No, they weren't aware. Oh. But I think I related it to things like the Holocaust. Yeah. I also mentioned that this happened a year after the Rwanda genocide. Yeah. Yeah. And what I did was I done things like I got articles from the media and I just showed some of the language, and I just got them to highlight some of the things that they thought that didn't feel right or that they didn't like. And then I did things like getting sticky notes and putting it on them with positive messages, and then walking into a room, and then negative messages of how they think they are perceived in the UK, and then walking into a room, and that was quite heartbreaking, breaking actually. And then it was just empowering them to see that if they did feel this way, what things could they put in place to make a change. Yeah. So that was one, and then I got my work colleagues who knew nothing about it to just make a pledge, each what they would do to make the society better, and put it on a piece of paper, took photos, and that for a whole week throughout the anniversary of Srebrenica was being played on TVs, so whoever walked into the centre would see it and learn about it. Yeah, wow, I think that is so powerful, isn't it? And even, you know, they can be really tiny actions, but actually they have a huge impact. You know, we were talking about language earlier and the kind of language that's used to describe events or people, and how this really colours, you know, our understanding. And I think even if we can get people to recognise that, and even maybe take one word out of that they'd usually use to kind of describe certain situations, that is quite a powerful message.
I think it is incredibly important, and I think just recently schools have actually started teaching kids to recognise things as fake news, which seems pretty funny, but actually is very important, because we live in a time where anyone and everyone could sort of become a broadcaster, can be somebody who produces a piece of news or article, and it could be seen as credible if you don't know where to look for information. So I think it's quite important, like the work that you're doing is teaching youth to actually be able to understand the information that they're being presented and working out what's wrong with it. So that's definitely very important. Rahat, what was your pledge that you made before you'd gone?
So I used to volunteer at our local radio station. So I did a show dedicated to that. And it was interesting because obviously the audience for that is very diverse, the age range varies. So I'd get some calls from older members of the community that would say, oh yeah, we remember this happening, that, you know, the government didn't do much, the international community didn't do as much as it should, we were watching it. And I think, as the caller mentioned, that there was this greater sense of, oh, this is a Muslim community that are being persecuted in Europe, essentially, and this sense of helplessness, and it was very close to home. And then the second thing I did, because when I came back from the trip, I did feel like I hadn't got as much out of it because I hadn't read enough into it. So I had these gaps in my knowledge, the gaps in significance of meeting some of the survivors or going to some of those centres and just thinking, I'm not getting enough out of it. So I was reading more, and then one of the things that impacted me most about the genocide was this question of identity. I think what was really horrifying about it happening in Bosnia, and I think we don't appreciate it, is the fact that it was a very integrated society. So we think Serbs, Croats and Bosnians, but it wasn't like that at the time, even after the breakup of Yugoslavia.
They were like the archetypal integrated society, weren't they, really?
Essentially, and it was very difficult, actually, during the genocide to segment people to say, oh, this person is Bosnian, this person is Serb, because there was interracial marriages. People might have Serbs, like, as the majority of their family members, but they might end up being Croat and things like that. So it was very difficult to even cause a genocide in something which was very mixed. And I wanted to kind of read more into how it was relevant to me. So I wrote an article about how I think it affects us in Britain, about having this identity. And it's, I think one of the tour guides mentioned that it's very easy for it to happen in places like London, which we kind of cheer about being a multicultural society and having all this diversity, but that could then make it very easy for someone to end up dividing a community that, although it has a lot of differences, is then used as an excuse to cause hatred. And I think a really important part of it isn't just to think, oh, we need to integrate and assimilate and all these kind of words that we might hear a lot, but to be able to humanize ourselves and each other. Of, you can look very different to people in your community, but if you have this sense of understanding of, this is a person who I, in a human, like a human level, won't let anything happen to, and I appreciate, that causes a better way of dealing with preventing a genocide, preventing hatred. And it doesn't have to come through like a physical change. It has to come through a change of state of the way that you approach and appreciate people that maybe on a normal level you might not interact with. And I think that's within the sort of political climate at the moment, where we have you belong to this party, you have these political views, or you have this faith and someone else has another. It's very easy to kind of fall into this trap of, we have to be divided. And I think we have to really appreciate that people have to have their differences. That's just the nature of the human being. If we were all exactly the same, it would make for a very boring society. But we have to be able to come together and just really appreciate someone's differences.
Absolutely.
And just say, I perhaps don't agree with anything you say, but I think I would stand with, like, you're my neighbour, I'm going to like give you sweets on Eid, I'm going to look after your house if you're on holiday, and I'm really going to take the initiative. It doesn't come from a passive way of, you expect others to do something, you have to take that step and do it for others.
Fantastic. I think that's a fantastic message, and that's a fantastic thing to come back with, because that's really what it's all about. And it's really interesting hearing how you've responded and how others that you've relayed this message to have responded. But we also want to hear from you as well. How do you feel? How old were you? How were you affected? How are you continuing to be affected by the events that took place all those years ago? Please do tweet in, hashtag Srebrenica Remembered at Islam Channel TV. It's certainly a good opportunity for us to reflect back and to remember.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's been a great discussion so far, but the discussion does not end there. There's a lot more to say, so we are going to go off to a short break, but don't go anywhere, because when we return, we'll be joined by some more guests, inshallah, on this sofa here, and continue talking about the Srebrenica genocide. So we'll see you after this. Assalamu alaikum.
Hello and welcome back to our live Srebrenica Remembered special. It was on this day that 8,000 Muslim men and countless women and children were killed simply because they were Muslim.
We are live until 2 p.m. today and we want to hear from you. So please share any messages of support for survivors of the genocide who continue to suffer till this day. The number to call is our usual studio number on 0207 374 6423. That's 0207 374 6423. Please also tweet us with your thoughts and prayers on hashtags Srebrenica Remembered at Islam Channel TV.
We have with us today Musti Kamal, who is a political commentator, Liz from Women's AM, who was in Srebrenica in 2016 and 2017, and Seema, who was at the delegation in 2014. We also have Ayla, a special phone guest who witnessed firsthand the systematic abuse of women. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Let's just you were Musti, you were obviously in Bosnia in 2014. I know we've been talking about some of what you were doing there earlier in the show, but can you just run through for some viewers who have just joined what the current climate was like then and where we've got to now politically?
Sure, absolutely. So I think we've briefly mentioned on what society was like in Bosnia previously. And I think one anecdote that perfectly sums this up is post-World War II, there was a beautiful story about a very old version of a Bible being preserved by the rabbi, the imam, and the main priest on Sarajevo's main road. And that's actually the only high street in the world which has all three main religious centers on one high street, a mosque, a synagogue, and a church. And so in that backdrop of religious coalescence, we saw this horrific thing happen in the late 1990s. And so that was a situation where neighbors were able to turn against neighbors simply because of the nationalistic and sort of putting people into boxes rhetoric that was used by the Serbian side. And that really underlined the conflict leading from 1992 to 1995. The atmosphere when I went in 2014 was of rebuilding. And so what we do notice about the Bosnian people is that they are very resilient. And that's manifested in many ways, whether it's the artwork that's come out of the genocide or the way that the mothers of Srebrenica, because of course a lot of the men and children had been killed, have been rebuilt.
We actually have a very resilient guest, like as someone that you described, a sister who's from Bosnia. She's in this country now, and we have her on the phone, and she's someone who is a child, about 13 years old, I think, in the war. Ayla, salam alaikum.
And salam alaikum to all of you in the studio and to your audience as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's not an easy subject to talk about. But first and foremost, the question, if you just tell us, how old were you during the war?
When the war started, I was 12. I was 12 years old.
That is really young.
Yes.
How did the war affect you, Ayla? How did it affect you and your family?
It has affected us in many ways. Obviously, we have suffered for more than 3 years. We have been under siege for 6 months. There was obviously a lot going on, especially to for a child, a 12-year-old child to take in. Obviously, it wasn't on my own. All my friends, family, school friends, we all have suffered in kind of our own individual way, but obviously as a society as well.
And tell us about what you witnessed, Ayla.
Well, to start with, we grew up basically together. It was the same nation, as a part of being Yugoslavian. I was born in Yugoslavia. System was obviously communism. People are living really well. Everyone was well off. People were educated. And as you know as well, and your guests will witness as well, when they visited my country, then most of the people are educated people, and they really like to advance in their life. That makes sense, not just for their own sake, but obviously for the community as well. For me, just the life changed just overnight, where our own neighbors, and I mean, your guest has obviously mentioned a Serbian side. Our own neighbors, they're actually Catholics. They would call themselves Croats, but they're not actually Croats. They're not from Croatia. They are Bosnian Catholics. Our own neighbors were basically traitors, and they took the troops through our own land to make us under siege.
And one
so
of the things
we were basically bombed by Orthodox Serbs from the Bosnian side, but in the same time, we were under siege by the Catholics. Does that make sense?
Yes. One of the things that you said when we had a conversation yesterday, and which was really interesting for me, was that overnight, your neighbours and friends, you felt turned against you. But
yes.
Explain a bit more about that.
So this is my point I was going to make. We were living in the peace. Everyone was friends, as brothers and sisters. Doesn't matter basically what religions whoever was following, because obviously in communism, religion wasn't really a great thing anyway. So overnight, if you see your own neighbor taking armed troops to your place of living, and they are, like surrounding you, you as a child, you don't know what to feel. You are looking at your elders, you're looking at your father, you're looking at your mother, you look at your, uncles. And bear in mind, overnight, they were armed. So, and for Bosnians, the normal Bosnians, like the civilians, they had nothing. My uncles were going to the front lines in their all-star trainers and in their normal tracksuits. Whereas opposing sides, they were properly dressed, like proper soldiers, and they were armed up to their teeth. So how does that happen overnight? So for me, it hasn't happened overnight. It's just that, we were not taught about our history, so we never learned from our, if I can say, mistakes.
So, Ayla, where are we now then? Obviously, you saw some horrendous sights during that time. I mean, where are we now? Why do you think it's important that every year there should be this anniversary, and that younger people and people who are starting to learn about what happened in the 90s, why do you think it's important to remember that today?
It's great importance for the younger generations, not to hold a grudge, not to be angry. It's important to have this knowledge. So, as for example, for me, for my family, for my friends, we can forgive, but for our own sake, not for the perpetrator's sake. Because you see, now in Bosnia, you have still places where Muslims can't go, where they were actually prosecuted from their own land. They cannot return. Or, for example, you have perpetrators, they are now mingling in the society where they have perhaps killed your father in front of your own eyes, or they have raped your mother in front of your own eyes, and now they are walking free. So you could be queuing up in your post office, in your shopping center, wherever, and you see these people. So some of them will say we were forced by Serbs to do this and we had no choice. There has been always a choice. We had patriots from my town that were Serbs who were patriotic, and they stayed on the Bosnian side. Some of them were killed for being patriotic, some of them survived. But that was their choice. So we should remember this day, not just this day because of Srebrenica, but obviously war, in particular, not just Bosnia war, I mean all over the world, the things that's happening, the new generation should know that this is not humane. Doesn't matter if I'm Muslim, if you are Catholic, if you are Orthodox, if you are Hindu, I don't care who you are. We are still humans, and we shouldn't do this to each other.
Ayla, how has this nightmare made you and the Bosnian people stronger? Because one of the things that you emphasize is you've gained strength from this.
Saying as well, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? So when you survive certain things, when you witness certain things, of course, at that point of time, adrenaline is high, you don't know exactly what's going on. But afterwards, because of that knowledge, it makes you think twice, it makes you want to learn your history, it makes you want to give this knowledge to younger generations, it makes you want to educate not just your own people, but opposing sides. Does it make sense?
Of course.
For example, it's a well-known fact in history that the Battle of Kosovo that happened before Ottomans basically came to Balkans, it has been won by Ottomans. In Serbia, in their books, they are celebrating this battle as a victory, which is out of mind.
Ayla, just before, because I know you don't have too long, just one more thing that we wanted to touch on was the fact that one of the things is clear, and there has been a lot of evidence that sexual violence was systematically used as a tool of war during the conflict. And I know you have witnessed, or you know many people have suffered from this. How are they getting help?
Hello?
Yes, so I know that you are aware of a lot of people who have suffered from sexual violence, who have been victims. And actually, I shouldn't use the word victim because survivor, they are survivors. How are they coping? Are they getting help? Are they still affected by the war?
Well, it basically, on speaking generally, in the general, people are, Bosnian women are really strong. So yes, they are coping. But there are cases on the individual level where people have breakdown. So I will give you just an insight, okay, from my head. If there was 50 or 100 women gathered in one room, like which is like a size of a classroom, because usually they were kept in the schools or, you know, in the different halls. And then you know that every single day 10 people will come and take you out and rape you until you're senseless, or drug you, or pour the alcohol down your throat, and then they'll just dump you back into that room, and then 2 days later, they will take you out again, okay? Many women did have nervous breakdown. Many women became pregnant. They tried to abort. Many women gave birth to these children, and they just throw them away. Many women kept the child. So you know what happened? Obviously, they would say, okay, you know, they would say to the child, you know, you are Muslim, your father just got killed during the war, whatever. But when those children reached age of 16, 17, and 18, they have found out that they are not yet teens, and that they find out that they are basically, you know, children that came out of rape. What is a very amazing fact that some of these children went back to Serbia looking for their fathers. So some of the women would commit suicide. Some of them, they would just, you know, throw themselves down, you know, into the river, or, you know, just go out into the front line just to get shot, basically, after, obviously, they were freed from the captivity. So it has effect, as I say, some they are strong, some are weaker. So it has effect on an individual level. It has affected women in a different way, basically.
Obviously, this is a traumatic experience for anyone, so
exactly.
then the reality, and it's a fact of war, that scars will remain. But thank you so much, Ayla. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your contribution. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Liz, just to go into the subject, because it was, up to this day, women suffer. When we went there, we went to a place called Medica Zenica, and they gave us a lot of facts and figures. And the reality is, especially now, a lot of those children who were born out of sexual violence during the war are in the early 20s. Yeah. A lot of them finding out from other people. And they are still, every day, just daily life is a struggle for them, even just getting into universities. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I think it's worth just bringing up here the scale of what went on, because obviously there are no official records, so it's a very, very broad estimation that around 20 to 50,000 women were in some way violated, and it was, as we heard, on a systemic level, a military level, and there was military planning behind it. And I know it sounds abhorrent to think of military planning being behind something like this.
Because there are actually evidences that claim a lot of the women were forced to stay when they were impregnated, and they wouldn't be left so that they couldn't have an abortion.
Yeah, they would be returned by coach loads sometimes to their hometown when they were, you know, 7, 8, 9 months pregnant, far too late to terminate a pregnancy if that was their choice, or to, you know, to get any kind of help or support.
And why was that? Just to clarify.
It was so that these children were born. It was to water down the Bosniak race. And this is the thing. This is what we see with the atrocities that took place there. The wiping out of the men, this ethnic cleansing in this way, the violating of women, that I don't want to use the word succeeded, but they have damaged the society to such a degree that you do see how it's very, very difficult for Bosnian people now, this sense of identity. It's a very, very delicate situation, particularly in places like Srebrenica. You really feel the kind of tense atmosphere there, the very tense relationships between the Bosniaks and the Serbs. So I think we can see how this military planning to a part has paid off, because they haven't ever returned to how they were before the war. And in a way, how can they?
Liz, did you feel that was when you were out there, that there was still that feeling that, I mean, like, this has now been classified as genocide. Do you feel like all genocides, they're appallingly planned? Just what you were talking there about the watering down of a particular people. I mean, it sounds shocking.
Yeah.
Obviously, that healing process is still happening. Do you think when you were out there in Bosnia, do you feel that enough, from talking to the locals, that enough was being done to tackle some of those? Because we heard from Isla that she was very angry, she was very frustrated, and rightfully so.
Yeah,
is that a result of perhaps something more than just an anniversary, that something more needs to be done by the tri-party?
Absolutely. And I think what we have to remember is today we're remembering the anniversary of the genocide that took place in Srebrenica. There was a lot more genocides that took place during that war. There was a lot more atrocities that people are never going to be held to account for, that we're never going to have memorials like we have with Srebrenica for other places. You know, we think about Sarajevo, that siege went on for, 1,500 days almost. It was a long siege. There was a lot of casualties, a lot of deaths, and all over the country we see things like this. So it's not about having almost having a day as a memorial is a start, but it can't end there. We have to look countrywide. We have to think about this more than just one day a year, and this is almost the point of the delegation, isn't it? That we go there and we bring back these messages, and we open it up to wider conversation, so we don't just look at it in terms of a memorial. But I think in terms of moving forward, it's very, very difficult. I mean, if you make the comparison to after World War II and what we see in Germany, and now we have, memorials that have been erected and memorial days, and a big effort has been made to move forward, to try and make amends, and that is a basis on which you can build bridges, and you can put a society back together. What we see in Bosnia, that doesn't happen. There's a lot of denial that goes on. There's a lot of people that are never going to be held to account, as our caller said, and it's very difficult to move on from that. How can you put something together when the problems aren't being dealt with or recognised?
I mean, I want to come back to that, but before I do, we still have Isla, and there's a comment that Isla is really keen to make. Isla?
I absolutely agree with everything that has been said. I just wanted to add, as the lady said, obviously it's not only about Srebrenica and about Serbs. I have witnessed Serb priests, they were blessing their soldiers before they were committing these atrocities. So they are basically giving them their blessing. God of men, who represents the church, is giving blessing to them to commit these crimes. However, it's not only Serbs, it was Croats as well. So mainly people tend to concentrate that this was the war between Bosnian Muslims and the Serbs, which is not correct. It was basically three ways, but obviously Croats and Serbs were basically against Bosnian Muslims. So obviously that has to be voiced. And as I said in the beginning, it wasn't overnight. It looks like it's overnight. In 1844, an order was formed in Serbia to basically called Načrtanja, which is an order to expand Serbia to become Greater Serbia. And that's why war started first to Croatia, because they wanted to separate, and then they also united forces against Bosnia because we wanted to seek independence as well. So my point is, just to conclude, we should forgive, we shouldn't forget, and we should educate, not just us ourselves, but throughout the world, and the people should take notice and out of people suffering, so it doesn't happen to them.
Thank you very much, Ayla. Thank you so much for that. I think one is to that point you made about not forgetting but learning from it.
Yeah.
But I think Ayla is very passionate about history. She's very passionate, and she's very adamant that we have correct understanding of history, and without knowing history we don't know what our identity is.
Yeah.
But I think, like Tom said, there was a lot of passion and I think a hint of frustration. I do Why do you think that is? Because I think the sense that we got is that when we were there, people still felt like they've got no justice. Yeah. They received no justice.
Absolutely.
Very
and
briefly,
I think the point that you make about knowing the history, this is really key, because what we saw, particularly in Srebrenica, and I talk specifically about that because that's where our experience was, but I'm sure other places feel the same as well. There were schools there that were used during the war as either places of execution or places to take women, to imprison men, or to violate men or women, actually. And these schools are now being used as schools again, and they're being taught that Radovan Karadzic is a war hero. So this is where we have to take ownership of the history, and
we
really
will
get
come
to the
back
facts.
to more history. I think it's a really important topic.
We're off to a break now, but don't go anywhere. When we return, we will be joined by Musti Kamal with further analysis of what has happened. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to our special Srebrenica Remembered. We're here today to commemorate the 22nd anniversary of the Srebrenica Genocide, a massacre that took the lives of more than 8,000 Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica and many more thousands across towns all over Bosnia.
And just to, fortunately, we have some live footages from Bosnia that will be on your screen in a minute. And remember, throughout the show, there we are, the footages of the coffins that the Bosnian people will be burying. Now, just to remind you, a lot of these coffins are remains that had to be identified over a whole period of years. And they have just literally been identified. They have literally just been identified, so the family have received the remains. And a lot of these bodies are not full bodies. So when we say that the pain is still so raw, this is one of the reasons. And today, after 22 years, some of these family members are going to be able to bury their loved ones. And in a lot of the cases, not even in their entire body. We'll go through the footages more, but remember, throughout the show, we are sharing messages of support. So do call in with your messages. If you have more questions for our guests, send in your support for the survivors of the genocide who continue to suffer till this day. The number to call is our usual studio number on 0207 374 6423.
And also, please do tweet us as well with your thoughts and prayers. Hashtag Srebrenica Remembered at Islam Channel TV.
But we also have joining us today Mustafa Kamal, a commentator, and Liz, who was on a delegation a few months ago, is here. Just to remind you, Liz was on the delegation with myself. And we have Amira Sharif, who's an IT technician and investment banking. Tell us the link, Amira. I mean, your background is very different to what we were talking about. What led you to go to this delegation?
Well, first and foremost, I work as an IT project manager on the investment banking side. And part of that, I head up a Islamic network in my place of work. So 3 years ago, an opportunity arose for me to be part of a delegation, and it was amazing. We had people who were Sikh, people who were Christian, people who were Jewish and Muslims. We all came together, we headed up various networks, and we decided to embark on this trip. To put this into perspective, I was 10 years old when the atrocities took place, so you can work out my age. And during my schooling period into secondary school, I learnt about World War II, I learnt about the Holocaust, I learnt about the slave trade, like Orlando Equiano, but I was never taught about what happened in Bosnia.
Yeah.
I knew something was going wrong. I remember in school I had a couple of refugees who had joined us in our classes, and at that age you didn't really know what was happening, and it was never really told to us.
That's really interesting, because now when I think back and have flashbacks and I think about some of the students, my peers in class, and what the background is really, at that period, we actually, at the school that I went to, we had a lot of refugees from war, especially from the Yugoslav area.
Yes.
It never clicked to me that these are refugees from the war.
No.
It's only now I'm remembering and I'm figuring out, which is really interesting, because you would think you would be prepared to receive these people who have come from such a traumatic background.
Yeah, I think it boils down to a lot of things. The curriculum is not taught in schools, where I have been engaging. My sister is a head teacher, so we're hopefully going to arrange a delegation of future leaders, to go out, learn about what happened, and hopefully try somehow instill it in a curriculum somewhere within the UK.
Yeah.
You know, also, I just think it's so important that no matter what your background is, to go out there yourself, learn about what happened, because what you read in the newspapers, what you see on the media, whether that be TV, etc., it's not always the case. And speaking to people out there, they have a very different version of events from Wikipedia and Google.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we can certainly echo those sentiments, because we did a lot of research and preparation before going out, as I'm sure you did as well. But then once you get there, it kind of it's very different, very different to how we imagined.
I think when you read about something, it's statistics. It's as though you're reading history about another world, another place. It's when you step down and you meet the people who actually went through it and you face them. It's very hard to meet, their gaze, knowing what they've gone through.
Yeah, it's very humbling.
Yes.
It is.
And it puts life into perspective. We think we have problems that we really don't. I mean, we might stress about our family, our mortgage, our job, but those are very insignificant things. We are very lucky, alhamdulillah, in the UK. We live side by side peacefully with our neighbours.
Yeah.
And we need to promote cohesion, we need to promote harmony, and promote that relationship with our non-Muslim friends, family members, relatives in some case. I have a strand of my relatives who are Christian. And it's about promoting that harmony, because a part of the genocide, the massive factor was this propaganda that started before the war around Muslims cannot live with non-Muslims, which is absolutely incorrect. And that was it was an undercurrent of what happened in Srebrenica.
Well, that's the thing, Musti. It didn't happen overnight. Tell us a bit more about the history. What is it that built up to this point in a society? And that's something that we found. It's very hard to differentiate between Bosnian Muslim and Serbian. And if you want to talk about integration, you couldn't get a more visually integrated community and culturally integrated community. So how is it that something like this could happen?
Sure, absolutely. So the ethnic similarity is, I think, a huge point, because the Baltics is in an interesting part of the world where you'd had various invasions throughout history, but it's at the border of Europe and Asia, essentially. So the homogeneousness, or the sameness of the ethnicities of the Bosnians and the Croats and the Serbs is really striking. And that led to a lot of peace, and that led to people living in peace for a long period of time until the 1990s. And I think what the Serbian army in particular was able to do was to frame this as a clash of civilizations. And there's definitely a lot of lessons that we can learn from that sort of rhetoric, and not to repeat those sort of mistakes. Because, like you said, it was framed as if Muslims are incompatible with European society, and that was simply not the case.
But what's interesting is the fact that, and one of the things during my research that I found out was, obviously because it was under communist rule for a long time, that whole area, and a lot of people like Ayla who lived there grew up, and she explained how, including their grandparents, because living under communism, they weren't really allowed to practice Islam. They weren't allowed to teach their children Quran. They weren't allowed to teach them about the religion. So there's a lot of those laws enforced. And that's one of the reasons why she said it resulted in a lot of people not really knowing much about Islam. The only thing that they knew was their name was Muslim. It was an Islamic name. So even when they got to this point, what could happen and what could lead to Serbians being successful in instilling a hate and making them seem like a completely different, incompatible group of people?
Absolutely. So some of the Serbian military leaders was really successfully able to absorb the empathy from people. And so your neighbor no longer became your neighbor. And like we heard from the caller, it was often the case of people living in the same apartment buildings, or even neighbors in terms of houses, where the neighbor would turn on someone overnight. And that really essentially came about because people were able to install a sense of otherness surrounding the history of the region. So I think in the middle part of the second millennia, the Ottomans actually invaded the region. And that was the sort of language that was brought back up by Radovan Karadzic, Ratko Mladic. And that's really dangerous, by phrasing this as a sort of clash of civilizations when it really shouldn't be.
And one of the comments that Ratko Mladic, the general, made when he entered into Srebrenica, one of the first things he said is, we're here to take revenge on the Dahiyas. Dahiyas as in revenge on what the Ottomans did for over 500 years ago. A 500-year-old wound or history, whatever that it was able to be used and applied.
What you said about the communism is really interesting as well, because the struggle of the Christians, the Jews and the Muslims was very much the same for a long part of the 20th century. It was a struggle to express their beliefs in freedom. And so once that veil was being lifted, that was replaced with a vacuum. And the Serbian military was able to exploit that vacuum by saying that Muslims are now the enemy and we have to take revenge for our ancestors. And that's really emotive, but that's something that harkens to today's society. And it's really important that we don't lose the empathy that we have for people regardless of their beliefs just because of a different strand of religion, because the ethnicity was the same.
Just to add to that, when I went out there myself, so you have three pockets of society. You have the Bosniak Muslims, you have the Croats, and you have the Bosniak Serbs. So to you and I, they look white and they have green eyes, blue eyes, brown eyes, and you cannot actually tell the difference between a Muslim and a Christian. So what is so shocking, as you mentioned, over time, people were not allowed to practice their religion and pockets of society became secular. And there was a lot of intermarriages as well between Muslims and Christians. So the fact that this took place, the war took place, was just devastating because it tore families apart, not just Muslim families. Let's not forget there were deaths on both sides, not just on the Muslim side, but also on the non-Muslim side.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. We were talking earlier with our caller about the idea of getting to grips with the history and understanding the history. And I think definitely bringing in the more recent stuff and going back, you know, to the Ottoman Empire as well. This is very important. But what I think now is more certainly relevant in our society as well is this rhetoric that we use around victims and victimisers. And I think this is... We have to be very careful there, don't we? Because we can see how, from the Ottoman Empire events and invasions, how this became not so much a catalyst, but certainly a vehicle with which to you know, convey these ideas of nationalism and the rise of a greater Serbia. But also since then, and since peace, you know, the Drayton Accord, the so-called peace agreement, we again have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of, you know, labelling the victims and victimisers. As you said as well, there were atrocities on both sides, and there were obviously empathisers on both sides as well. So I think this is also a lesson that we have to remind ourselves, because we can very easily get drawn into the trap of this is a black and white issue. It's almost like old westerns, goodies and baddies, and that's it. And I think certainly what we took away with us from the delegation is that this idea of how we rationalise ideas and how we convey those ideas is something very, very important, and that can have a pivotal impact.
The lessons that we take from it. And I think even this whole point about, because of the whole build-up as to what led them to the point that they can see the Muslims as the other, that they see them as the aggressor, the fact that they're abnormal group of people. Because I know some senior scientists that actually said that the Muslims had an anomaly gene to justify othering the Muslims in such a way. But the point is bringing this to this reality now, because there is no point constantly commemorating a war that's happened 20 years down the line, which is still pretty recent, to be quite honest. But we are in a situation now where a lot of otherism rhetoric is used, if that makes sense. So it's not the purpose of just remembering a war. Well, how do we apply this today in the current climate that we are in? Because we are in a climate where groups of peoples are being otherized and dehumanized by the language that is being used against them. There has to be purpose to this commemoration. It can't be just for the purpose of commemorating.
Absolutely. I think it's really important not to make this just an anniversary that we revisit every year. And there are definitely a lot of lessons that are relevant. And I think above all, the overarching lesson that I certainly took away from my delegation was that of empathy. And we live in a society, as you rightly said, where empathy is in a complete shortage. And to view someone, regardless of their identity, their religion, race, whatever it may be, and have a vested interest in their well-being, I think that was something that was present in Bosnian society for a very long time, and that was taken away simply by the use of inflammatory rhetoric. So it's very simple to fall in the trap of finding your tribe and saying, I'm going to stake my flag in the ground here, and I'm part of this group, and I'll only defend this group. Whereas as humans, I think we do have a duty to realize that our oneness is very important, and we should preserve that. And I think that's really relevant in today's society.
And one of the reasons that this project in creating hate was successful is because there are those who remain silent as well. There have always been those who have empathy, which is why today, do you think, how important do you think is it for us to engage in dialogue with people who are more objective and who will see beyond the hate?
Absolutely. I think when you stay silent about something, it's as if saying it never happened. So when I met the mothers out there, I don't ever cry. It's like blood from a stone. But when I went out there, I cried because I looked at the footage, I spoke to the mothers. There were women who had lost every single member of their family. Now let's put that into perspective. Grandfather, father, son, husband, the whole lineage was wiped out. So one message that they did say to me was, please share our message and integrate into society. Focus Islam in a positive light. And I think we can do the blame game. United Nations had a huge part to play. every single other country that stood by, Muslim and non-Muslim, had a massive part to play in this. They did nothing.
Yeah.
Let's be real.
And that's a really important point that we do want to come back to. Just very quickly, the Imam is saying the Dhuhr Adhan in Srebrenica right now. So if you can just play out the Adhan. Is it?
حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
Wow, so that was the Adhan for the Dhuhr Salah there in Srebrenica, and it's very emotional watching it. Huge crowds of people. Shahina and myself prayed there on more than one occasion, and we can see families, family members there to commemorate. Many people will be burying or reburying loved ones if remains have been found. Obviously, less and less is found each year.
That's the part where they've gathered for prayer. There's a little bit like a giant canopy. It's a beautiful sight. We've prayed there together, and it's a very, very serene point, and this is where they're praying at the moment, and I can imagine how they must be feeling.
And it's quite a dramatic scene. Lots and lots of the just the very plain white pillar gravestones, just obviously hundreds upon hundreds.
And you can see it at a really far distance, and it's a reflection of the number of people that have been killed, and it's not even all of the bodies. So when you go there, you're actually surrounded by those white, pristine stones. It's a very significant view. It's one that once you see it, it's very hard to forget. And these people are surrounded by that. And it's a very emotional place to be at.
It's a sea of graves. You cannot see where it see where it starts, but you cannot see where it ends.
I think that's a beautiful way to describe it. It literally is a sea of graves.
Just geographically, for the viewers, this is actually Srebrenica itself. So just opposite where the prayers are taking place, there's the warehouse where 2,372 people were quartered in by the UN Dutch troops and had very few ways out. And the people trying to get in were refused entry.
Yeah. And they do say that the youngest member of this genocide was a baby who was, her mother had actually given birth in that warehouse, and there was no medical facilities. It was appalling conditions. As you can imagine, as being a mother myself, you need every sort of medical support possible at that time, and the baby died. So that is when I went out there, I learnt that, and I did not know that. It's so devastating.
Which was that place, because what you see now is people praying at the area where the grave is at. But just as you said, just opposite is the warehouse. It's a very contrasting, visually very contrasting, because it's very cold. We found it very cold and very almost.
Very stark, very. It's dramatic and quite moving to be in there and remember what took place. And also, it's worth remembering that we're talking about the genocide, which was a matter of days. But don't forget, for years before that, there were people flooding into Srebrenica, and it was like a giant. It's been described as a giant concentration camp where they lived for a very, very long time. As you said, without medical supplies, many people had operations without proper medications, anesthetics, gave birth without the proper medical care and attention.
Because you're right, the aid and the food, water was restricted in Srebrenica. It's an enclave. People that haven't been there, it's surrounded by woodland and forests, and you can easily perch people on top of these hilly areas, which is what the army did, and sniped into Srebrenica to kill people.
And that's another visually, when we got off our bus and we looked around, the whole place is surrounded by giant valleys, and it's green, it's lush green. And one of the things I kept saying to Liz was that I'm finding it really hard to see the beauty of it. Even though it's green, all you see is red, because you know this is the place where all the men ran into. And even today, there's remains there, because there are pretty much a minefield, and people, they can't bring the remains back. So when you look around them, it is stunning, it's actually stunning, but it's very hard to appreciate knowing what's happened.
Yes, I believe there was 70% Muslims in terms of population prior to this war, and post-war 3% remain. So it's a huge contrast.
Yeah, more Bosniaks from Srebrenica actually live in the US than live in Srebrenica today. So that, I think that gives some indication of how successful or otherwise the Drayton Accord has been for individuals when we hear statistics like that.
Yeah, and also Srebrenica also resides now in the Republic of Srpska.
Yes, exactly.
So it's controlled, you know, by...
Well, this is it's something that I found hard to swallow. I was speaking to a survivor called Hassan Hasanovic. Yes. He lost his father and twin brother during the death march, which he did to escape the Serbs. And this death march, he walked for about 6 days and 6 nights. And one of the things that I found out via speaking to him, and he said, so when the Drayton Accord happened, they already had a peace deal in place, so everyone had to disarm, the Muslims had to disarm, the Serbs had to disarm, except it was only enforced on the people in Srebrenica, which is another controversy regarding the war. However, having happened, and then the genocide happened, and the Serbs entered, and they killed a lot of the Muslims, even after that, Srebrenica was handed over under Serb control, so which is now is called Republic of Srpska. Now, for a lot of people who listen to this is a shocking thing to happen in a place where genocide happened, where the Muslims were killed. That place was then handed over to its perpetrators. How are people supposed to view this?
Well, the people in Bosnia feel that justice hasn't really been served. After the war, as you mentioned, Srebrenica is now in the Republic of Srpska. So when people went back to Srebrenica to claim their houses, to claim their land, they were no longer able to do so.
We're going to come back to this issue of justice and moving on in a little while, inshallah. Thank you so much. But we do have to go to another quick break, but join us again after this when we'll be hoping to shed more light on this day from 22 years ago. Assalamu alaikum.
Seconds. Welcome back to our live Srebrenica Remembered special.
Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, the similitude of believers in regard to mutual love, affection and fellow feeling is that of one body. When any limb of it aches, the whole body aches because of sleeplessness and fever. And this is from Muslim.
If a Muslim anywhere in the world, in the center of the body or the tips, on the finger or on the toes is hurting, we should feel the same pain. The Bosnian Muslims have not received the justice and closure they need, and so cannot rest, and so neither should we. It is our duty to have a concern for our brothers and sisters.
Share messages of support and solidarity for the survivors of the genocide who continue to suffer till this day. The number to call is our usual studio number. It's 0207 374 6423. Please also tweet us your thoughts and prayers on the hashtag Srebrenica Remembered, and the handle is at Islam Channel TV. Join us now. We have our another special guest. Shaheen, if you'd like to do the introductions.
I'll do the honours.
Yes.
We have with us Edo Dedovic. Edo Dedovic lives here now. He was in Bosnia during the war. Is a survivor. We also have Umar Farouk.
Abdul Farouk.
I knew I'd get that one wrong. There's a lot of Umars in my family. Abdul is 21 years old, and you were about 19 years old when you went on the delegation in 2015 to Bosnia. And we also have Samir Mihanovic. I'm very looking forward to speaking to. Samir is a director and producer of a brilliant documentary called Fog of Srebrenica. We will show you a trailer. It's one definitely worth watching, and I would recommend anytime if you want to get a good introduction to the Bosnian history and the war. But we will come back to that. But just to come to Edo first, tell us a bit about yourself and your experience during the war.
Well, I was about 9-10 years old during the war. I was in Sarajevo. We were under siege. And maybe after like 6 months or up to about a year of the war, I suffered injuries, which resulted in me needing to leave Bosnia to come to England for medical treatment. So we were the first kids and few adults that were allowed to leave Bosnia and Herzegovina, Sarajevo, legally. So we were actually allowed to get on the plane and leave in, I think it was August or September of '93.
And what's it been like for you? I mean, coming from, you know, probably a very secure, happy childhood to the way things had changed so quickly, did you understand what was happening at the time?
Well, I was told I just need treatment, but obviously I cried. I didn't want to leave. You know, my big wish during the war was to stay, to fight for my country, to protect my people.
At the age of 9 and 10?
At the age of 9 and 10. So, you know, all you can see...
I suppose you were young adults already in your thinking.
Yes, I mean, because all you're watching on TV is what's happening, and you're expecting any night to be attacked or the bomb might fall. So, you know, one big wish is to, you know, try and help your people. And I didn't want to leave because I felt like I would be seen as, you know, running away, and, you know, I wouldn't be welcome back.
Such a weight of the world to carry on such young shoulders.
Yeah.
Did you have to leave a lot of your family behind as well?
Yes, I could only come here with my sister and my mum. So the rest of my family remained in Bosnia.
And how has that shaped sort of the person that you've become? I mean, obviously experiencing something like war would have, you know, a lasting effect on you psychologically, as well as your outlook on life. How has things changed? So pre-war to, you know, having gone through it and then come out of it, how's your attitude to life changed?
I mean, attitude to life before I was 10, I was just a kid just looking to play around. But what's happened, you know, since after the war I came here, and obviously with the facial scarring and everything, it was difficult first few years. And, you know, people randomly on the street coming up to me, oh, you know, fighting is not good for you, you see. And I'm like, I had nothing to do with any fights. But over time, you know, you kind of build confidence and you understand better, you know, why conflicts happen, what happens, what was going on back home. And then it kind of shapes you into like thinking, you know what, I want to be here. I want to, you know, I want to do something to help people, to make them feel better about themselves, and so on.
I mean, it's quite different when you're hearing, you know, an account first person to when you hear about something that somebody else has been talking about. And inshallah, we'll come back to the rest of this discussion. But we do have the adhan for the janazah prayers at the moment in Srebrenica, so let's go to that.
ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام يا مولانا يا الله فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون يا مولانا يا الله وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين الفاتحة.
So corrections there, it wasn't the call to prayers for the janazah, but in fact a beautiful dua recited by the brother there. So just before going to see that piece of life coverage, we talked about the difference it makes to hear, you know, a first-hand account of what somebody has been through, because a lot of the times when you hear about these stories, it's through articles, it's through books, it's sort of through word of mouth from somebody else who's gone there. So it's quite different when you hear that firsthand. So Abdul Farouk, you've had the opportunity to actually go and speak to some of the people who've been affected by this genocide. So what has that been like for you in terms of, as a young person in the age of 19, probably never exposed to such violence, to actually experience, you know, somebody's story in that way?
I mean, before I read, I vaguely knew about what was going on, but it's just another thing that you read in the news, isn't it, really? But I think I'm thankful to Remembering Srebrenica because it organised this delegation. And it was just a group of young people that we all went together to Srebrenica itself. And it was I think it was a very emotional experience, but it was very important as well because it was the 20th anniversary that year, and we met survivors firsthand. So it's an individual called Hassan, who's quite well known, who runs the memorial there. And listening to his story firsthand and what happened to his family, that's when it really hits you.
Definitely want to talk more about Hassan because that brother has some inspirational stories.
Yeah.
But before we come back to that, we've got the janazah happening in Srebrenica right now, so we're just going to go to that.
الله أكبر الله أكبر السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله رضاء لله الفاتحة. آمين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين ولا عدوان إلا على الظالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. الحمد لله الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور. الحمد لله الذي قال في كتابه الكريم ولا تقولوا لمن يقتل في سبيل الله أموات بل أحياء ولكن لا تشعرون. اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت وعافنا فيمن عافيت وتولنا فيمن توليت وبارك لنا فيما أعطيت وقنا شر ما قضيت إنك تقضي ولا يقضى عليك إنه لا يذل من واليت ولا يعز من عاديت تباركت ربنا وتعاليت لك الحمد على ما قضيت ولك الشكر على ما أعطيت نستغفرك اللهم من جميع ذنوبنا ونتوب إليك بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Hvala Allahu koji je dao smrti život da bi nas iskušao koji će od nas bolje postupati. On je silni onaj koji prašta. Hvala Allahu koji je u svojoj časnoj knjizi rekao i ne recite za one koji su na Allahovu putu i ubijeni mrtvi su. Ne, oni su živi, ali vi to ne znate.
So we saw just part of the janaza and some du'as there being recited. Just for a reminder to all those who are watching, we are actually streaming live on Facebook. So please do show your support and do your part by also sharing these clips so that those who are in your contacts lists are also able to watch this and gain awareness about what's happening and what has happened in Bosnia and Srebrenica. So before cutting to the janaza prayer, we were speaking to Abdul Farouk about your experiences of talking to survivors and getting first-hand accounts of the things that they'd been through. And obviously, being 19 years old, what impact has that had on you, since hearing those stories, and how has that changed maybe your perception on how things are?
I think after having the visit, you just become a lot aware about how small intolerances build up to something like that. Because hearing the stories, it just started off as neighbours insulting each other. That's how it started off with, but slowly nationalism creeped in, Islamophobia, and it just became this monster which led to ruining thousands of people's lives. And you become a lot more aware now of that after seeing something that's happened already.
And Ada, growing up in the climate of obviously when things were shifting, did you as a young child actually understand this shift in attitude that your neighbours would have had towards you being a Bosniak?
To be honest, in Sarajevo, where I was, I had neighbors of different religions, and we stayed with them during the war. They stayed on our side, so that we were protecting them, they were protecting us. So we just saw it as good versus evil. We saw it as they are coming to us to attack us and kill us all, just the same.
Did your experience make you more conscious of Islam? I mean, did you have much of an awareness before then?
Yes,
because a lot of the people that I spoke to said it made them question their name. What is it about their name that made people hate them?
Well, I mean, for me, growing up in former Yugoslavia is you kind of seen, religion came kind of second to being Yugoslav and so on. But what came to me was, I think, just before the war started, one of my friends in school, so we were in, I think, in year 2 or year 3, and he said to me, "Oh, my president will kill all yours. You guys are going to be finished pretty soon." And we were like, the rest of the kids, we were in this hotel in Pale, and we were like, what's he talking about? Like, we didn't even know who our president is, who our leader is. And so, some of the sections of the Bosnian people already were telling their kids as young as 8 or 9, that they're going to win something, while the rest of us had no clue. I mean, we just thought, oh, there's few feuds and this is going to be finished.
Did that leave you confused? Did that lead you to asking a lot of questions?
Yeah, I mean, I got home and I was like, who's our leader? Who's going to win? Who's going to, why is somebody going to disappear? Why is hatred from somebody I went to school with for 2 years already, 3 years? But he was still kind of our friend, but it was like a little battle that you get.
It's the playground banter.
Yeah. And I just didn't know what he was really talking about. For me, it was all new.
I think it's been 22 years now, so there's a lot of aspects about the war that people are still, learning about, and so, which is why we're doing this awareness. For those who are hopefully interested and who want to learn more, and I'd really, really encourage you to look into and research, and because there are lessons. when things happen, we should learn from it. And this is one of the reasons why these delegations happen, why these documentaries are produced, why we do these shows, so that people learn from it. Just so I'm going to leave you with a documentary directed and produced by a trailer of a documentary directed and produced by Samir Mihanovic. We're going to leave you with that for a few seconds and come back to you.
Svemogući Bože, ujedini naša srca u vjeri i ljubavi, učvrsti korake naše u pravdi i istini, osnaži volju našu u...
We will come back to the trailer because it is definitely one worth watching. But while we wait for the trailer, Samir, tell us a bit about the documentary and why you made it.
Well, I kind of felt always that there's not enough good films made about Srebrenica and what really happened, and I think people that have been killed, the victims somehow, you know, finish their lives and that's it. But the survivors, the families, are still carrying all that. And I think it's very hard for them to continue life like this because obviously not only that justice, you know, what happened in the past happened, but there's no justice that have brought, you know, much. In 22 years, there's 20 people persecuted for this crime by International Criminal Tribunal, and there's no apology. You know, I think we cannot blame all Serbian people for doing this, but definitely the government of Serbia and Republika Srpska need to acknowledge genocide. That International, you know, Criminal Tribunal in Hague did declare Srebrenica as act of genocide. An apology need to be made to be able to have reconciliation. So through that thoughts, I went and on very minimum budget, I have worked with basically filmed myself with a friend and then edited in my flat in Edinburgh. So, and then it became, you know, recognized and successful film that tells story not only intolerance in one place in the world, but something that we can learn all around the world, you know.
And I watched it yesterday. I watched the whole thing. I've been meaning to watch it for such a long time. I've heard such good reviews about it. And it is definitely one that I would recommend because it actually, you break it up really well. It's nothing complicated, but you give a good introduction to the war. It goes step by, you have chapters to it and it goes through different aspects of the war. And it also covers, there's a woman who unfortunately suffered sexual violence and in really brutal manner. And she does go into a little bit of detail into that. So there are various aspects of the war that is covered through it. Did you intentionally, specifically ensure that there is in terms of a woman who talks about her trauma?
Absolutely. You know, I had different characters as well that are not in the film, but I had to stick to at least one example of sexual violence, you know, because these women were raped, and the Bosnian government evidenced about 50,000 women were deliberately raped. And there is no justice for them, and some of their perpetrators are chief of police in a village where she comes from, Sasa near Srebrenica. So the point is, you know, not only that they have been raped, they're not allowed to speak about it because, you know, there's no witness protection. So through that's a huge issue. And actually, only in '99, you know, that rape has become war crime because of so many cases from former Yugoslavia, especially in Bosnia. And till then, it was a tool of rape. So even that, but also to listen that story and edit, you know, and just like to repeat, it's very difficult because, you know, there's some stuff that haven't fit into film. There's a lot to tell, and obviously, I'm glad that this year, you know, Remembering Srebrenica is using, you know, gender and genocide, breaking the silence, and that's a major subject also that needs to be explored today in modern war,
and I think
like
we
in
find
Syria.
That when wars happen, one of the biggest victims of war and to be violated in the most inhumane ways are women. Except we don't hear about that. And there are a lot of reasons why, because it's not that black and white. In reality, you've got to consider the culture of the society, and it's a very sensitive thing. And so unfortunately, what's happened in Bosnia for all these years, these women have suffered in silence. And then when there is a process in place, it's such a complicated process that you can come out publicly and declare that this has happened in a very culturally sensitive society, and then get no result, no justice at the end of it.
But there's also the children to consider, because I remember reading pieces written by young men and women who were children born out of that sexual violence. So, you know, their mothers who were victims and their fathers who were the perpetrators, who were Serb, you know, part of the Serb forces who actually attacked these women. So there's a lot to consider. I mean, in terms of the consequences that women and children are facing, do you feel that there's still consequences for them even now, after 22 years?
You know, the sad thing, through financial hardship, I don't think in Bosnia there is some kind of well-organized rehabilitation process in which women can come out and talk to psychiatrists and go through this trauma, which is very sad. And not only that, they're deprived from, you know, basic things, which is one part of the film, is that probably some money have been poured in Bosnia, but these women didn't get it. So, you know, we have huge, you know, social issues where you need to eat and you need to live, and you need to buy antidepressants. So you need to go through this trauma in silence by yourself, you know. And this is a very, you know, sad thing that I don't see how this will progress and heal. I myself, I'm a filmmaker. I can preserve and tell the story for the future generations. We hope that this will not happen again. And it's important part, but I cannot deal with the social issues and problems, which I really hope that you know, they just have to carry on with life. And it's also not very, you know, it's not very discussed, you know, and it's not very brought out. And I don't see. I believe some women organization from UK, probably, especially even from Muslim world, can, I believe, work a lot towards it to help.
There was a very brave lady in your documentary who and she said, some people don't want to talk about it, I will talk about it. Yeah. And she said, she clearly said, if it wasn't for antidepressants, being on tablets, she wouldn't be able to cope. And this is since childhood. She suffered as a child during the war. Yeah. And it's the pills that keep her going.
Zinahida, she was 13 and they killed all her family, basically. And then she grew up with her sisters, so she lost 5 brothers, mother, father, and another 50 members of her family. And then the problem there is lack of recognition. And you know, I was checking news today, and world somehow wants to sweep under carpet this, especially with this new kind of silent war that's happening between West and Islam. You know, that actually now is not popular or anything. You know, I was laughing with Edo before. You know, if you say Allahu Akbar, they think you're a terrorist. You know. So in that way, that Bosnian war, genocide in Srebrenica, and also the perpetrators, they are trying to diminish the word genocide. They are laughing, you know, if you look in the comments on the Facebook of what happened today, and they're saying we killed terrorists. So the new terminology they are using is what Western media and some politicians are using, that all Muslims are terrorists. So therefore, you know, that actually you were asking about name. You know, in Bosnia my name is Samir. And in Arabic is Samir. I don't speak Arabic. You know, my parents were practicing Islam even during it. But it's the first time when I came to UK that I realized, oh wow, actually, you know, we are killed because we're Muslims, and Europe cannot deal with Muslims in Europe, and that means that even now it's still the same.
Which is what this is. I mean, we're going to come to this more because this is a really worrying issue because we are living at difficult times. But before we come back to that, we've got the trailer now. We'll leave you with the trailer. Take a look at this very powerful piece.
Nemoj, Mehmede, tamo da gledaš kosti, da gledam lobanj, pola mu je lobanje ima, pola nema.
Tako je. Koga god od komšija, pa što bola ne spaste, makar jednog naših brata ili tu, bez obzira ili oca ili ne znam, mi nismo tu bili, pa ima liko da kaže da jeste.
Pa za buduće generacije moram reći da ako mogu uopšte da se oslobode istorije.
Rat je stao, ali za nas žrtve još uvijek nije, uvijek se rat vodi.
I mean, you can see just from, you know, a short trailer of just 1 minute, 20 seconds, you know, you can already get that feeling of just, you know, why is nothing being done? Why haven't our questions been answered? And, you know, it's very much what you've been talking about, Samira, the fact that, you know, it is much of a subject that is being swept under the carpet. We will come back to actually discuss that and how that parallels with what's going on at the moment. But first, we're going to have a look at the live link to Srebrenica to witness the burial that is currently happening. So let's have a look at that clip. So there we can see
the graves.
Yeah, so these are the new graves for the newly identified 71 bodies, and this is something that's been happening, you know, year after year. You know, the continuation of burying those who have been lost.
If I may say, also the part of film, you know, I was very deliberately using just the facts, something that International Criminal Tribunal. So the Serb bulldozers digged lots of graves to hide the crime. So they displaced the graves. So basically, the way they're carrying coffin, I could see just before in the footage that they found just one bone. And the one lady in the film is saying, I cannot bury like this. And it's very insulting for Muslims not to be able to bury body. But they did it deliberately to hide. So some of them are picked from 4 graveyards. So today they're not burying the bodies, they're burying anything that they found through DNA analysis, and also through these screenings in Aberdeen and Glasgow. I met forensic officers who were so depressed because they had to go through this whole ordeal of finding anything that is linked to the person, and it's still over 1,000 bodies or evidence of what happened. So it's all about denial, and it's our duty to break this denial.
This is why this is so traumatic. And even watching this right now of family members burying their loved ones, it must be killing them, because they know they're not burying their entire family member. So for some people, it's just a part of the leg. Some people, it's just a part of the skull.
And the grieving process actually doesn't end. I think you can't really get closure if every year you're having to bury another part of, you know, your loved one's body. So it's never, you can never shut the door and then begin your healing process, because it's not really ending.
And this has been happening where some family members had to re-dig the family members out of the grave that they buried them thinking they've got closure. And then another part of the body has been found through DNA testing, and the following year they have to re-dig them and rebury them again. Can you imagine, after 22 years of waiting for your family members, and then to not even have the entire family? When do you get closure? For people who can never get a closure, how can they ever overcome or even move on?
There are those who have yet to find even missing family members. I mean, we've seen clips where women have been talking about the fact that, you know, they've buried maybe their father or their younger brother, but still there are other family members who are still missing, that they've not found anything. And there's still that hope that perhaps they've escaped, perhaps, you know, they've managed to hide out and make a life for themselves. But it's when you have events like this year on year, where new bodies, new parts are being discovered, that people are starting to finally come to the reality of actually, you know, then maybe they're not just missing, maybe they are really, they have passed on.
Well, on that, I have to say also that Srebrenica is just one place in Bosnia that was culmination of all that was going on for over 3 years of war, because there's Prijedor, in which 3,000 Muslims and Catholic Croats were killed, and there is concentration camps, Omarska, etc. There is Visegrad, Foča, Eastern Bosnia cities, Zvornik, that have Bratunac. They had same destiny in just smaller numbers, and this is crime that has not been yet rectified in the way that the perpetrators are brought to justice, and the government of Republic of Serbia and entity in Bosnia, Republika Srpska, have to apologize. You know, they have changed since then, the leaders. But unless you accept the guilt and say this did happen and acknowledge it, then denial is bringing more collision that this can happen tomorrow again.
So when I was at the visit, I actually met the mayor of Republic of Srpska, and the graveyard was a 5-minute drive from there. And he was like, I'm not visiting it. Nothing happened there. It's just people that died. And I met him face to face, and seeing someone say that when it's in the backyard, it just shows you that the people are still living through it today.
I think it is. I think it's the worst thing that could happen is if somebody is telling you to your face, well, sorry, you know, you might have had family members who have died, but you know, it didn't actually happen, you know, and, you know, having to deny the loss and the grieving that you're having to go through simply because they do not want to admit their guilt as part of what has happened. I think it's something to cause a lot of anger, but surprisingly, I think when you see how the Bosnian people have actually dealt with it throughout sort of coming up to the 22 years now, you don't see that anger there. There is more a sense of we just want justice and we want to be able to move on.
This is what I witnessed in making documentary with survivors, that, you know, the great thing, they're not full of hatred, they're full of some dignity, and they're never identifying all Serbs with the crime that has been committed. And that's really superhuman strength. On the other hand, I have shown film in Venice, in Vienna, in Berlin, in Westminster last year, Holyrood in Scotland, and in Fort Collins Cell, and this year is going to be on Al Jazeera Arabic. So it's like, you know, there are many people that are really supporting cause of remembering Srebrenica, like last night in Northampton. You know, it was the Orthodox priest who went to Srebrenica and who presented the film. And as well as Manchester was sold out the other night, the screening. So there's a lot of good people that are fighting the cause. And I think this is the way to join organizations like Remembering Srebrenica, or just help them, or go and visit Srebrenica, because that is also support. And to be honest, this is how we build a better world, because you know, of course there is lots of problem with Islam as well, and what's happening in Syria now is a shame. But I think if people are making world to be injustice place, to place where people don't feel welcome, then we will have some, you know, people who will take, you know, extreme ways to try to sort out justice. And I think this is problem not only for UK society, it's a problem for the world.
I mean, this is where the people, one of the things that I found when I went to Bosnia is the people that are just absolutely, I met mothers of Srebrenica, and these are women who lost family, and they're part of this organization that is called Mothers of Srebrenica. And these people, unlike yourself, coming out and telling these stories, it takes a lot of courage to constantly repeat your suffering, your trauma. That is not an easy thing. That in itself is traumatizing. But they are doing this. They are telling the stories, and it is our job to take those stories. There's a responsibility on us to take the stories and convey it. They're doing their bit, and we need to do their bit. And just on that note, Samir, because I know you have to go, but where can we access your documentary?
Well, at the moment, it's showing in the festivals. And in that way, I have to protect the film, and it is available on Vimeo on demand at the moment. But in a year or two, it will be publicly available as well. Video on demand is no expensive; you can buy and watch. And I'm hoping to screen one day on Islamic channels. So.
Oh, that would be brilliant. For those of you who missed the name of the documentary, it's called The Fog of Srebrenica. Look it up, and definitely worth watching. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Samir. We really appreciate it. And may Allah make it easy for you to go make more documentaries.
Absolutely. I'm making now about Syrian refugees film that hopefully will be finished soon. So you know, it's also another story that's quite important to the world.
Definitely.
And I do really hope that we create a better world for all, and more equality, and more just self-reflection. What can I do about this? And that's how I started this documentary, completely without money. But as again, it belongs to survivors, and I really hope that your audience will go and visit Srebrenica.
I mean, brilliant. Thank you very much, and I hope Allah brings you success in all your documentaries, because we definitely need to know what's going out there, and via your work, we learn.
Absolutely. I think, yes.
I was going to say we have a clip coming up now. So, and despite the time that has passed since the genocide, many are still grieving for the lives of their lost ones. Let's find out more.
22 years on, and bodies of this genocide are still being recovered. Loved ones are again having to rebury their family members. For many, the grief of losing their sons, brothers, husbands or cousins is not over, with new bone fragments being found causing a fresh wave of grief.
In 2006, I already buried my husband and one of my sons. Today is the youngest one who is buried. The oldest one was never found.
Does the discovery, though, of newly identified bodies help those affected?
For a mother, despite the time that passes by, the pain remains the same. It can be 1 year or 20 years later. It's the same. My wounds will never heal.
This feeling of never-ending loss is a common theme for many in Bosnia.
SubhanAllah, after all these years, the wounds are still fresh and the tears are still flowing. Many families are yet to experience closure as countless bodies are still missing. And perhaps one of the most painful thought is knowing that even after 22 years, many have not received justice. We cannot allow ourselves to forget what happened 22 years ago. So please, please raise your hands in du'as for the victims and stay tuned to find out what else you can do.
So, SubhanAllah, you know, we've talked about the way in people's perceptions can change. And I think, Ido, yourself, you know, having been at that time where things had changed so drastically, and Abdul Farouk, being a young person who's grown up here, you can start to see the way perceptions and language towards people is changing even now. Do you feel that the lead up into what happened in Bosnia, are we seeing the same sort of tactics and things repeated now? So I'll ask you that first, Ido.
Yeah, I mean, you saw it, I think, last year quite a lot with the Brexit and everything, where you slowly just, you know, you're talking, you know, to what you consider your friends, your mates, and then you hear, you know, your other friends saying, you know, receiving a text from another one going, oh yeah, I voted for Brexit, so we're going to get rid of all the Muslims. And you're like, it has nothing to do with, you know, this is about...
How does that make you feel, coming from a war-torn country and being your people killed because of your religion, to come here and hear something like this in a country that you came to for safety?
Well, obviously, I mean, first thing you get worried and you think, okay, this is leading along the same lines, and in the same kind of messages when you speak to people, go, oh, it can never happen here, and it's exactly the same thing my dad said to me when I got home. Oh, don't worry, no, it never happened here, and so obviously, you know, you do get worried, and you try to speak to as many people and, you know, tell them actually it can. You know, these things are not funny. You know, this idea that, you know, people are coming here, and, you know, like this sheer idea of like how we look at refugees at the moment. We kind of see them, oh, you know, they're taking our hospitals places. You know, these people don't want to come here because they want to take your job or your hospital place. They're going anywhere to stay alive.
Are you finding a similarity in the language that is used to describe people?
I mean, yeah, I mean, you do. There is loads of similarities in it, and there's loads of slight divides already, you know.
How does that make you feel, Abdul, being brought up in this country, to have gone to Bosnia and seen what's happened to, because it seems like this has happened to other people, but to hear a survivor say that the language is very similar here?
So last year I was on here as well, and I said at that point in time it was
not made a difference now. This is quite worrying for people.
I think it's absolutely true. I think we have to kind of hold ourselves to account, because we feel like, okay, maybe there's nothing I can do. This has already happened. It's in the past. You know, there's possibly nothing I can do. But the thing is that we do see the same sort of rhetoric being repeated here and actually throughout Europe and even in the US, where you see people's attitudes have shifted, where people feel confident in actually being vile to other people who they perceive as being different to them. And the fact that, you know, we see that as being like, oh, well, you know, it's just a few people, they're just being silly, you know, it's fine. The fact of the matter is, it's not fine.
It might be an apt time to mention Martin Luther King's quote, where he says, we won't remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And I think it's quite apt time to remember that quote.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, you know, it's very important to actually continuously talk about this. So what do you feel is a meaningful way to engage with others in actually trying to continue this conversation about what's happened in Bosnia, particularly where we see not much coverage about it? So we hear coverage a lot about other genocides that have happened elsewhere, but not so much about this one, Abdul Farouk.
I think one thing that stood out for me when I read was that this does not exist in the national curriculum in schools. You learn about a select few things, but this is so recent, 20-odd years. So it's very relatable for young people, because I spoke to one of the survivors who lived in Sarajevo as well, and he was 20 when it happened, all that, and his life was much similar to ours. And those similarities will actually make it easier for young people to relate to. I think that's a very important thing, that if at a young age you're made aware about this, it's always there in the back of your mind.
I think it does it. It will enable you to kind of actually understand that these things can happen anywhere at any time. And I think we'd like to think, well, the 90s, you know, it's a very modern time, it's a very recent time. How could anything of that magnitude possibly have happened? But I think it's, again, it's about taking those lessons from these events. And as part of an annual peace march to Tuzla, there were boys and men of all ages who walked 63 miles as a sign of solidarity on the 3rd of July. So let's have a look at this clip to find out more.
Nažalost, evo godinama idemo da sahranjujemo one koje nađu, tako dalje. Jasno je šta predstavlja odlazak u Srebrenicu, odnosno ukop tih pronađeni, zvjerski ubijeni, ne znam koji izraz da upotrebim, jednu ogromnu tugu, a Boga mi i vjerovatno i obavez.
Ja idem s ponosom, nema pripreme, nema ništa, ovo je samo dobra volja. Meni je ovo ponos, jedan ponos i drago mi je što je većina ovih ljudi sa svih strana svijeta krenuli.
The annual Peace March, or Mars Mirror as it's more commonly known, is a commemorative walk in honor of the 15,000 men who formed the column and embarked upon a perilous 63-mile walk from Srebrenica to Tuzla in an attempt to escape Serb persecution. Over 70 citizens of Sarajevo start the march from Sarajevo to Nezuk, also known as Tuzla, today.
Ove godine prijavljeno je 68 učesnika, najmlađi učesnik je 17 godina, 65 je najstariji. Imamo učesnika iz Hrvatske, iz Srbije, imamo iz cijele Bosne i Hercegovine, od Bihaća, Mostara, Jablanice, Konjica.
The anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide has brought together hundreds, if not thousands, of people together in order to pay homage to those who have passed away in this tragic events. We will show a clip which we will come to later on. But just to come back to you, Abdul Farouk. Obviously, you haven't lived, but the people in Bosnia have lived. But talking about we come back to this issue of war rhetorics now. Sorry, the words, the kind of similarity in the kind of rhetoric that is used to talk about the minority groups. And then you have globally a lot of other genocides going on as well. As a young person, having gone and seen this and to find it relatable, has it inspired you to come here and be more active and feel that you can actually make a difference?
I think the most important thing is that as Muslims, we lost our political voice and we fear telling our opinions and what we think. And if you don't speak up against it, report these Islamophobic attacks and what people say, then it becomes very normalized. And I think that's one of the most important things that people need to comprehend, that look, people will call you what they want, but you got to stand up for what you believe in and what's happening to you. If you don't that, if you just stay silent, then people will just keep treading over you. And I think that's the most important thing. So if you do see something happen, that people should stand up for what they believe in, because in the end, Allah is there to help you. You should stand for what you believe in.
I think one of the things that you said was that before going to Srebrenica on the delegation, that you actually hadn't known that much about the history of what happened there. What actually prompted you to choose to go there?
I mean, I was emailed an opportunity from my sister that they're looking for 20-year-olds to go to there, and just had a quick look on the internet. What is it about? And it seemed like it's a really good opportunity to go and learn something new, because it's not every day you get to go to a different country and actually learn firsthand about something that's happened. And from that, I think it's inspired me to be more involved within the community and also just be more aware of myself about what's going on around the world.
Has this also made you realise the importance of dialogues with people of other faiths and other backgrounds?
Yeah, I think that's another thing, because as you said, you hear people having conversations here and there, and it's important to put your viewpoint across, because you're the Muslim person and your view never really gets heard. It's always what the media's portraying. So if you're there to actually input in that conversation and discuss these matters, most people are very, if you have a discussion with them, they're very happy to know your viewpoint and they become more understanding. But if they don't have the discussions with you, then you start being classed as the people that don't mix and all these kind of things.
I think that's one of the arguments that's used, isn't it, a lot of the times with people from ethnic minority backgrounds, in particular when it comes to sort of the discussion surrounding Muslims, that, oh, Muslims don't mix, they don't integrate, you know, we don't really know what they're about. But this wasn't the case in Bosnia, Edo, as you were growing up. You said that actually people didn't care where anyone was from. Everybody was friends, neighbours, you know, even mixed families. So tell us about what the reality was like before the war occurred. How were things between everyone, the minority groups in Bosnia?
I mean, in the capital where I was brought up, it was normal. I mean, people marrying within religion, with the opposite religions and so on. And so people were just pretty much, you know, your neighbors were your friends, and you didn't look at their name.
You were brought up in Srebrenica, is that correct?
Sarajevo.
Sorry, Sarajevo.
Yeah, yeah.
The reason I mentioned that is because actually we went to Sarajevo and we went to the old town.
Yeah.
The original city that was created by the Ottomans when they were there. And one of the amazing things that stuck out for us was literally around the corner there's an Orthodox Jewish synagogue. Around the corner from that, there's a church. Around the corner from that, there's a massive masjid. What it shows is reflective of a community that lived there, that thrived together. And the fact that they're so close, at close proximity, it's a reflection of how that community really had no issues, literally.
Exactly. I mean, my godfather was Orthodox Christian. He was my dad's best friend. And strangely, he was with us the 2 days before the war started, and he ended up going on to the other side. Which tells you how certain people who didn't want to actually ended up having to decide, and probably, like in my opinion, making the wrong decision. Which is why I say it's really important to read up on history and see the history of the people there, and maybe we can take lessons from that as well. But unfortunately, I know, Edo, you have to leave, and Abdul, you have to leave as well. But we are so grateful for you being here. Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's really important to kind of highlight sort of the human stories behind this, so people don't forget about what's happened.
And seeing young people here coming and, you know, taking the voice and the stories out there and trying to make a difference. Thank you so much. Hopefully we'll have you back here again next year. Look, we're off to another break now, but do stay tuned. We'll continue to shed light on this day 22 years ago.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to our live Srebrenica Remembered special. It has been 22 years since the worst atrocity that took place on European soil after World War II. More than 8,000 men and young boys were killed simply because they were Muslim. Most young men who represent a lost generation that would never have had the opportunity to fulfil their potential.
Many of these men are yet to be found. So far, 91 mass grave sites have been uncovered in Srebrenica alone, showing the extent of the attempts by Serbian forces to cover up their crimes.
The International Commission for Missing Persons is exhausting all efforts to find and identify the victims of the genocide. They, however, face numerous obstacles, one of which is that the bones to one individual can be found in numerous grave sites. The ICMP has said that one man's remains were uncovered in 4 different grave sites.
Now, joining us now, we have Shahina, who went to Srebrenica in 2016 and 2017, and Ismet Ruat, a lawyer who was also part of the 2015 delegation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Walaikum salam. It's really good to have you on the show because, alhamdulillah, as a lawyer, you are the president of the Association of Muslim Lawyers, so you can kind of bring in sort of more technical sort of terms and ideas for us to kind of understand some of the things that happened in this genocide. Now, we were talking actually just before coming on live that you know, it took 21 years for this to have been called and recognised as a genocide by the UN. But why do you think it's taken so long?
Well, one of the most devastating aspects of this entire episode for the families and survivors is the whole issue of genocide denial. And denial is actually one of the last stages of genocide. There's 8 stages. Denial is one of the last stages. And this is actually stopping people from ever being able to reach closure. Now, you mentioned people finding their loved ones' bones 4 different places. That was the desecration of human bodies was one of the hallmarks of this genocide, because that is what it was. When we went on our study trip, and I can't praise the charity Remembering Srebrenica enough for what they have done, we went into a forensic area where they actually had laid out a replica of bones from a survivor and taped off the four different places that the skeletal remains had been found. So in order, not only was this a genocide, but it was worsened by the fact that people's bodies were desecrated, dug up, put somewhere else, put somewhere else, put somewhere else,
and no dignity
in order to frustrate.
Yeah,
no dignity at all,
in
order to frustrate.
The fact that they killed this many people.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I'm sorry, going back to the genocide denial, we were just discussing how this is absolutely unacceptable. It took 21 years. There have been other genocides where it has not taken so long, Rwanda, etc. And a lot of this is political.
Yeah.
And I would lay the blame at the International Court of Justice, because they had the opportunity to actually say this was a genocide, and they fudged the issue.
Yeah.
And it's all political, really. They fudged the issue and said, oh, well, Serbia could have done more to prevent it. But this is something that I know a lot of charities, spearheaded by Remembering Srebrenica, have been seeking to have acknowledged.
I mean, there's so many, there's quite a few worrying things regarding in terms of, I mean, a lot of things can be assumed as to why it took so long before we termed it a genocide. But you got to remember, the actual Srebrenica, I shouldn't use the word massacre, genocide. Genocide happened, the killing of the amount of people happened in an area that was declared a UN safe zone. Now, what does that mean? That means that the United Nations have claimed that bit apart and declared that bit to be safe. And as part of the deal, they disarmed the Bosnian Muslims, who were up to then protecting themselves and defending themselves with what little arms that they had, which is why the Serbs couldn't infiltrate that area. Now, as soon as it was declared a UN safe zone and the Serbs were forced to disarm, while the Bosnian Muslims were forced to disarm while the Serbs were not, it left the place, literally it was lambs to slaughter.
Yes.
And so the Serbs, when they entered into Srebrenica, completely entered without any sort of retaliation from the few Dutch soldiers that were left there. There were supposed to be strikes. Also, a lot of the people who were defending that area were told that there's going to be airstrikes from the UN to help them. So they left the positions to go and they withdrew back into the areas where their families were in the town. So there was absolutely no self-defense whatsoever. Now, this was done under the instructions of the United Nations and right under their nose. Okay, so you got to remember there's a lot of responsibility that has to be claimed here and makes the issue quite a bit more controversial.
I mean, they were left helpless and defenseless, and I think that's the worst position that you can put someone who is a victim. And I think one of the things that you said was the UN said that the Serbs could have done more. Now, how could you expect, you know, an attacking force to have done more to protect the people that they're attacking? Even now, where, you know, the government is actually denying that there ever was a genocide.
No, absolutely. Well, that was what the International Court of Justice said. But you've made a very important point about the United Nations, and there's a very poignant piece of graffiti that you saw as well that actually says united nothing. The United Nations failed these victims again and again and again. The Dutch peacekeeping forces failed them, but the Dutch government did actually issue a formal apology. I can't remember how long, but it was more than 10 years after, actually issued an apology. So it was... Sorry, I just...
I think about the United Nations.
Yes, the United Nations, and actually even our government failed them. Governments across the world, not just the UN, but governments as well. Jack Straw, who was the then Home Secretary, after the slaughter of over 8,000 Muslim men and boys, actually made a public apology. But all of these recognitions was far too little, too late.
Far too little, far too late,
And then twisting the knife by denying that it was a genocide.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's you've raised some really interesting points there, which I'm sure we're going to come back and touch upon these in a bit more detail. There is hope that missing family members who have managed to escape and survive elsewhere. But unfortunately, this has not been the case for those who are now bearing members of their family who have been missing for some 20 years. We're going to have a look at this clip for some more information.
I'll bury my father and my brother. It's sad, but we can't avoid it. I have nobody. I've already buried 2 brothers. It's as if they came here to die. It's so difficult and painful because I anticipated this for so many years. I hoped they would return alive, but now, no.
Here is my brother. His bones were decomposing in the forest. 7 years ago, they found just 2 bones, and I was not allowed to bury only those bones. But last year, more were found, so we added them.
Međutim, da su našli ljetu prošle godine još nešto kosti, pa su dostavile.
In March 2016, a UN tribunal found former Bosnian Serb leader Radovan Karadzic guilty of genocide over his role in the killings of 1995 in Bosnia and sentenced him to 40 years in jail. Though international courts have recognized the Srebrenica massacre as an act of genocide, this is still denied by Serbia and Bosnian Serbs. Serbs will not admit genocide in Srebrenica since it did not occur, as said by Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik. Dodik, president of Bosnia's Serb-run Republic Srpska, added that the national day of mourning for the Srebrenica victims would not be observed in his entity. One of the mourners in Srebrenica said this was a source of regret. Bosnia's 1992 to 1995 war claimed some 100,000 lives and left the Balkans country deeply divided along ethnic lines.
I mean, this is kind of, you know, showcasing again the things that we've been sort of reiterating throughout the start of this program, is that the grieving process doesn't seem to end for any of the people who have survived this this war. And, you know, there are people who haven't been able to bury loved ones because they didn't have enough of their remains to actually bury. Like the woman who said at the end, you know, she said they had 2 bones and they were told, no, they have to wait until more is found before they can do a burial. So I think it's one of those things where it's this wound that just is not able to close. And I know that, you know, you wanted to comment on some of the stories that you heard as well when you went on your delegation.
It's what we're discussing, some mothers who have actually been able to bury, but only bury 2 bones, 3 bones, the remains of a finger, just to achieve some form of closure that they've put their loved ones to rest. So,
and then there's the people that have never found anything at all. You know, up until this day, they're still expecting that there's at least one mass grave that's not been uncovered.
Some people who are just so traumatized by this, the fact that they've lost all these members of the family and they have to then go do DNA tests and wait for the process. So there's actually literally some family who just completely.
I mean, there are those actually who are, you know, who are there at the funeral processions that actually, there are distant relatives, but actually they're there to represent other family members who have possibly even passed away before they could have found or identified certain body parts. So there was one woman who said that I'm here on behalf of my cousin because she has passed away and is not here to bury her son.
Yes, so they've died without any answers, without any form of justice, with this whole genocide denial, and without being able to bury their loved ones.
Absolutely. I believe we've got another clip to show now.
So on the anniversary of the Srebrenica Genocide, which is today, it's marked by mass prayers from those who have lost close family relatives as well as distant ones and friends as neighbours as well. So let's have a look at the clip of that procession.
22 years after they were killed in Europe's worst massacre since World War II, the remains of newly identified bodies are being buried. The youngest, Avdija Memić, was just 14 when Bosnian Serb forces in the Bosnian town killed 8,000 Muslim men and boys in July 1995, 5 months before the end of the country's inter-ethnic war. The oldest, Mustafa Hadžević, was 77. The coffins containing remains of the most recently identified victims will be buried at a memorial site after a service attended by several thousand people. Widows and daughters wept as men tried to comfort them. Many mourners knelt next to the coffins. Some caressed the cloth coverings or placed flowers or said prayers. Other mourners waited near the freshly dug graves where the remains of their loved ones will be laid to rest after prayers are read.
It goes on every year, and heartbreaking. We can't be, you know, just talking amongst ourselves. We can't imagine what, you know, what those family members are going through, what they're feeling.
That's the thing. There seems to be, when it comes to war on this scale, there is never-ending pain. It's ongoing. And here we're talking about burying of people. There's that side of the suffering, and then there's the other side. There's so many horror stories that has come out where, you know, mothers have had to make the decision of taking the life of their own child or daughter just so that they don't go through the trauma of being brutalized and violated by a number of soldiers.
I think it's one of those things that it never stops being shocking when you hear the accounts. Even if it's an account that you've heard before, it's still shocking because you think, how could it be possible that, you know, people have done this to people who they knew and probably grew up with? And we have now joining us Sister Sheila Osmanovic, a doctor, mashallah. You've been with us a while, and you've been on the show last year as well. And you're Bosnian yourself. Can you tell us why it's important for us to continue this conversation about what's happened in Bosnia, and in particular the genocide in Srebrenica?
Assalamu alaikum, first of all. It's very important because what has happened in Bosnia in a way is unfinished business. It hasn't been kind of concluded in many ways. It hasn't been concluded in terms of politically, economically, but also on a more personal level, or on a tragedy base, as you just mentioned, that many people are unable to bury reminiscence of the loved ones they've lost, but also majority of women, because we are talking about the gender.
Okay, we've got some sound issues at the moment, so we're going to come back to you in just a minute. But we were just looking at a clip about the procession, about the, you know, every year we see this, loved ones, families, reburying, you know, reburying people, and it's just absolutely devastating.
I mean, one of the things that we've heard from sort of the younger guests that we've had on who've been on the delegations previously, they'd said that actually prior to going on these delegations, they actually didn't know much about Bosnia and what happened there. I mean, what made you choose to go on this delegation yourself?
Well, I found this interesting because I was actually, I was quite a bit older than the delegation that I went with. We had some people older than me, but a lot of them were younger. So when this occurred, a lot of members of my family, my brothers and cousins, they actually went to Bosnia. They took vans and lorries to take aid, some of which didn't get through, and that was another aspect of the issue at the time. So I was very much aware of it. My family were involved, but this is something that too many countries for too long have ignored. So it's never been part of any school syllabus. You know, just as, you know, slavery isn't part of the school syllabuses and so on. So Bosnia was never ever discussed at school, apart from Jack Straw's apology. The Western media went very quiet about this for a very long time, and I have to credit Dr. Wacker for, you know, setting up Remembering Srebrenica, because I think that's really spearheaded keeping this very, very current and highlighting the ongoing problems to date.
It absolutely has. Thank you so much for that. We are going to go to another clip now. We're going to be going back to the burials. These are the 71, I believe, newly discovered bodies that are going to be buried today. So take a look at this.
If any more proof is needed that war hurts years after the first shot is fired, then this is it. Families and residents of Sarajevo in Bosnia pay their respect to 71 newly identified victims of the Srebrenica massacre, in which over 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and young people were brutally murdered by Bosnian Serb forces. 2017 marks the 22nd anniversary of the Srebrenica killings, which formed part of a wider devastating civil war that resulted in the deaths of around 100,000 people and all but destroyed any economic prosperity for generations to come.
Reconciliation has no alternative. The party that has been a victim of the genocide must, each time, regain the strength to reach out those who belong to the party who committed the crimes and the genocide, but who are not criminals themselves. There is no other way. But it is very difficult to behave like this for all of us. While voluntary provocation and denial continue, while some of the people want to stop these positive processes of reconciliation, denial of genocide is constant.
In a similar manner to those of us who pay our respect to the millions of people killed in the Holocaust during the Second World War, each year of remembrance always helps to heal wounds, even if only by the smallest of amounts. But, like the Holocaust, it also brings back nightmares.
The terrible genocide that took place in Srebrenica is something that we commemorate each year during the month of July. And I think that these commemorations remain as important now as they were in the early years. And I think it's important that we're all here to recognize these victims.
With each year that passes, more victims are identified. For some, it allows them to mourn and find some kind of peace. But for others, it's too late.
I've come to pay homage to a cousin, more than 20 years after his disappearance. He was killed in the forest when Srebrenica fell and has just been found, but it's too late for his mother, who died 5 years ago, and who will not be able to bury him.
It's very likely that in the coming years more bodies will be discovered and identified in Europe's worst massacre since the Second World War. But for the time being, at least, this anniversary will continue to play an important part in the reunification of a country whose divisions still exist today.
So, again, another clip. I think with all of these clips, I think it helps to inform us of the numbers, the statistics that we all hear, because I think that's the one thing that people always want to know, that to make things a little bit more real is to have these numbers there. But Dr. Sheila, you know, as a Bosnian yourself, what do you feel is the lasting impact of what's happened now? I mean, it's 22nd years from when this war ended and when the massacre, or rather the genocide, has occurred. What do you think that has left people with now?
Well, genocide itself, what is a great victory when you think of the denial that happened throughout the Bosnian War. First, we had the discussions whether it was a civil war, whether it was this type of war, whether it was a religious war, that type of war. In the end, with the verdict as genocide, we know it wasn't a civil war, we know it was aggression. So that's a kind of massive advancement in terms of debates that are in media, academia, and in public. Now, the thing is that we all have to face our own garden, as it were, to make sure it's cleaned before we want to kind of go ahead and settle the unfinished business in Bosnia, as I mentioned. So many things are still going on in terms politically, as it happens, whether it is, even though we have the verdict, still we are going on, whether it's called massacre or it's called genocide. Whatever it's called, we have the fact that 8,732 people have died. We know who committed it. We know this, the army of Republika Srpska, that nowadays even exists, you know, and that is celebrating the day when it was formed. So we have all these issues that somehow we have to face. But the problem is that we can't make people face the problems they have. We somehow have to educate them that they themselves see the problems. Or if the Bosnian side, if there are issues that we have, probably we have first to start from ourselves, addressing the issues we still have in terms of economy, in terms of neglect of the population who survived, because the situation in Bosnia is, as you've seen, you know. So if we only were to face these problems, issues, acknowledge them, and do something positive about them, then obviously we can then demand that the other do the same, but we should really start from ourselves first.
So any last messages from you, Esmet, before we go off?
I think the parallels that we're facing in our society today and internationally in terms of intolerance, rise of Islamophobia, extreme right-wing parties gaining credibility, I think we need to be very, very careful to learn those lessons. What happened in Bosnia, what happened in Sarajevo, in Srebrenica must never, ever happen again. But, as you say, there is still so much unfinished business. So I think it's learning the lesson and showing that we've learned the lesson, and at the same time still supporting the community in Bosnia and still helping them. As you've said, there's still so many outstanding issues. So we must never forget them, and we must never stop doing what we can to help.
And also not to forget the current genocides that are happening around the world. I think the Bosnia lesson for us, Liz and I especially, we talked about a lot, that when we came back, we said, you know what, we are in a position, we have platforms, we have tools that we can utilize to tell their stories, carry their stories, and to, you know, carry the stories of the current genocides and the wars that are happening at the moment. And because we don't want to be 22 years down the line where our children ask, what did you do? And we say, oh, we did nothing when we knew. And I think it's really key that we learn and implement what we can to ensure that, you know, this is not ignored. There's genocides currently happening, not ignored. And the current rhetoric and the climate that we're in now, that we do something about it, and we engage in dialogue, we ensure people are aware of what is happening, and also realize, you know, what happens on our land, on our, you know, garden is linked to what's happening elsewhere around the world as well. We're not individual group of people living on our own. We are linked to everyone else around globally, to the lands, the seas, and the people in other nations. So be politically aware, know what's going on,
and
engage yourself.
Absolutely. Jazakumullah khairan to all of our guests and to all of you who have donated and who've actually called up and given your messages of support. You know, as things have passed, you know, and the wounds are slowly beginning to heal, there is yet much more work to be done.
We leave you with this hadith on the authority of Abu Hurairah, may Allah be pleased with him. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said, whoever relieves a believer's distress of the distressful aspects of this world, Allah will rescue him from a difficulty of the difficulties of the hereafter. That was recorded by Muslim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.